Spring had brought a hard lesson with Mrs. Dubose. Her sharp words and frail body, teaching Jem and me about a courage that didn't need a gun. Jem's rage had torn through her camellias, but her demand that he read to her, and Atticus's explanation of her fight to die free, left us both changed. The Radley place, with its quiet gifts and unseen blanket, was still there, a mystery that felt softer now. But Maycomb was growing louder, its whispers about Atticus's defense of Tom Robinson turning into shouts. Jem was pulling away, his 12-year-old world bigger than mine, and I felt left behind, caught between his silences and the town's growing tension. As summer returned, hot and heavy, a new adventure was waiting. One that would take me beyond our street and show me a side of Maycomb I'd never truly seen. Summer in Maycomb was a familiar embrace. The air thick, with the scent of honeysuckle, and the buzz of cicadas. But this year felt different, like the town was holding its breath. Jem was changing, his moods swinging like a porch swing in a storm. He'd grown taller, his voice sharper, and he'd taken to telling me to act more like a girl, whatever that meant. I missed the old Jem, the one who'd plot with Dill, and me, chasing Radley mysteries under the stars. Dill wasn't coming back. This summer his mother had remarried, and he was staying in Meridian, leaving a hole in our trio that made the days feel empty. Atticus was busier than ever, his days swallowed by the courthouse, his nights spent with papers spread across the kitchen table, the lamp casting shadows on his tired face. The Tom Robinson case was all anyone talked about, their voices low and sharp, like knives hidden in whispers. With Atticus gone so much, Calpurnia took charge, her presence steady as the oak trees lining our street. She'd always been part of our house, her hands quick with a spoon or a scolding. But I started to see her differently, like a bridge between our world and another I didn't know. One Sunday, with Atticus away and Jem moping in his room, Calpurnia said we could come with her to church, her church, First Purchase African ME, out past the town's edge. I'd never been to a Negro church before, and the idea sparked something in me, a mix of curiosity and nervousness, like stepping into a new game with rules I didn't understand. Jem was hesitant, his eyes flicking to the Radley place as we left, but he followed, his air rifle left behind, his hands stuffed in his pockets. The walk to First Purchase was long, the sun high, and the dirt road dusty under our feet. Familiar streets gave way to narrower paths, lined with small houses and patches of garden, the air carrying the smell of fried greens and wood smoke. First Purchase was a plain building, its paint peeling and its steeple leaning slightly, but it stood proud, like it knew its place in the world. As we approached, folks turned to look, their faces a mix of surprise and suspicion. Calpurnia walked tall, her Sunday dress crisp, her hat tilted just so, and I felt small next to her, my dress itching against my skin. A woman named Lula stepped forward, her voice sharp, asking why Calpurnia had brought white children to their church. I felt my face burn, wanting to hide, but Calpurnia's voice was firm, saying we were her company, that we belonged where she did. The others nodded, their eyes softening, and we were welcomed in. Though Lula's glare followed us inside, First Purchase was warm and close. The pews worn smooth by years of hands and prayers. The air smelled of wax and old hymnals, and the voices rose in a song that was different from our church, richer, like it came from the earth itself. There were no hymnals most folks couldn't read. Calpurnia explained. Lateran the preacher, Reverend Sykes, led the congregation in lining, singing each line so the others could follow. I watched, my hands folded in my lap, as the voices filled the room, strong and sure, carrying a kind of hope I didn't hear in Maycomb's white church. Jem sat stiffly, his eyes on the floor, but I could tell he was listening, his face softer than it had been in weeks. But Reverend Sykes's sermon was about sin and salvation, his voice rising and falling like a river, and I felt it pull me in, even if I didn't understand every word. He spoke about the town, too, about Tom Robinson, though not by name, his words careful but heavy with meaning. I glanced at Calpurnia, her face still, and wondered what she thought of Atticus's case, of the whispers that followed us. After the sermon, they passed a collection plate, not for the church but for Tom's wife, Helen, who couldn't find work because of the town's anger. Reverend Sykes counted the coins, his voice firm, saying they'd stay until there was enough. And I saw folks dig deeper, their hands trembling as they added what they could. I felt a pang, thinking of Atticus, of how he was fighting for Tom, while Maycomb turned its back. On the walk home, the sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the field. I asked Calpurnia, Wife spoke differently at church, her words softer, more like the folks there. She stopped, her eyes meeting mine, and said shettled, the way folks understood, that she lived in two worlds, ours and theirs, and knew how to move between them. I didn't get it, not fully, but I saw something in her face, a kind of strength I hadn't noticed before, like she carried Maycomb's weight in a way Atticus did, too. Jem was quiet, his hands still in his pockets, but he asked about Tom Robinson, about why the town was so mad. Calpurnia's voice was gentle but firm, saying it was about fear. About folks not wanting to see things change, even when change was right. Back home, we found Atticus at the kitchen table, his papers scattered, the lamp glowing softly in the evening light. He looked tired, his glasses low on his nose, but he smiled when he saw us, asking about church. I told him about the singing, the collection for Helen, and he nodded, his eyes distant, like he was seeing something we couldn't. Jem asked if Atticus thought he'd win the case, his voice low, and Atticus said he didn't know, but he'd fight with everything he had. The air felt heavy, like before a storm, and I thought about first purchase, about Calpurnia's two worlds, about Atticus standing alone against Maycomb's anger. The Radley place was still there, its shutters watching, but it felt small now, a shadow next to the trial that was pulling our town apart. As summer deepened and the heat pressed down, Maycomb was restless, the trial drawing closer like a storm on the horizon. A new visitor was coming to our house, one who'd bring rules and expectations, pushing Jem and me to face Maycomb's ways in a new light. As the fight for justice grew louder around us, Summer had opened a new window into Maycomb, taking Jem and me to Calpurnia's church, where the voices of first purchase and the collection for Tom Robinson's wife showed us a side of our town we'd never known. Jem was growing up fast, his moods distant, leaving me to wrestle with my place in a world that felt bigger and stranger every day. Atticus was buried in work, the Tom Robinson case pulling him away, while the Radley place stood quiet, its mysteries softened by the blanket and not all gifts. But Maycomb was restless, its whispers about the trial growing louder, and as the heat settled in, a new presence was about to arrive, one that would shake our house with rules and expectations, making me question what it meant to be a Finch. In a town divided, the summer sun was relentless, baking Maycomb's streets until the dust rose in lazy clouds under every step. The air was thick with the smell of cut grass and the hum of cicadas. But our house felt different, like it was waiting for something. Atticus came home one evening, his tie loosened and his face tired, and told us Aunt Alexandra was coming to stay. I'd known her from Christmas at Finch's Landing, her sharp eyes and sharper words always making me feel like I was doing something wrong. She was Atticus's sister, tall and proper, with a way of carrying herself that said she belonged to a Maycomb older than the one we lived in. Jem didn't mind her as much, but to me, she was a storm cloud on our horizon, ready to rain rules on my overalls and my freedom. Aunt Alexandra arrived in a swirl of suitcases and perfume, her hat perched like a crown, her dress crisp despite the heat. She stepped into our house like she owned it, her eyes sweeping over the furniture, the books, the way Calpurnia moved through the kitchen. I stood in the doorway, my hands stuffed in my pockets, watching her settle in with a kind of purpose that made my stomach twist. She hugged Jem, her smile warm but brief, and gave me a look that said I should be wearing a dress, not overalls caked with dirt. Atticus was gentle with her, his voice calm as always, but I could tell he was tired, caught between her expectations and the trial that was eating up his days. Calpurnia kept her distance, her face unreadable, and I wondered what she thought of this woman who seemed to think she ran the house. Aunt Alexandra wasted no time. By supper, she was talking about family, about the Finches and their place in Maycomb's history. The dining room was warm, the smell of fried chicken and collards filling the air, but her voice cut through it, sharp and sure. She said we needed to live up to our name, to act like Finches, not like the wild children she saw running around. She talked about our ancestors, about Simon Finch who'd built the landing, about the cotton fields and the courthouse, about how Finches were meant to be ladies and gentlemen. I didn't understand half of it. Words like heritage and gentility sounded like school lessons I didn't want, but Jem listened, his fork pausing, his eyes on her like he was trying to see what she saw. I just wanted to escape, to run to the backyard where I could be Scout, not Jean Louise Finch with a capital F. The next morning, Aunt Alexandra was up early, her coffee cup steaming, as she sat on the porch, watching Maycomb wake up. She called me over, her voice firm, and said I needed to start acting like a lady, that I was too old to be climbing trees and fighting boys. I bit my lip, thinking of Cecil Jacobs and Francis, of how I'd promised Atticus not to fight, but still felt the urge every time someone spoke against him. Jem was no help. He was off with his air rifle, his mind somewhere else, leaving me to face her alone. She talked about cousins I'd never met, about family traits like Finch, stubbornness. And I wondered if she saw me as a problem to be fixed, like a dress that needed hemming. The Radley place was across the street, its shutters still, and I wished I could hide there, away from her rules and her talk of family pride. Atticus came home that evening, his briefcase heavy, his face lined with the weight of the trial. Aunt Alexandra was waiting, her hands folded, and she started in on him, saying Jem and I needed more structure, more background. She wanted us to know our place in Maycomb, to carry the Finch name like a badge. Atticus listened, his eyes tired, and then he called us into the living room, the air thick with the smell of his pipe and the faint hum of crickets outside. He tried to explain, his voice halting, about what it meant to be a Finch, about the family's history and our duty to uphold it. But his words felt wrong, like they weren't his, and I saw Jem's face tighten, his hands clenching. I didn't want to be a lady or a Finch, not if it meant giving up who I was. And I said so, my voice louder than I meant. Atticus stopped, his eyes soft, and said he didn't mean it like that, that we should just be ourselves. I could tell he was caught, trying to keep the peace with Aunt Alexandra while staying true to us. Jem stormed out, his footsteps heavy, and I followed, my heart racing. We sat on the porch, the night warm and starry, and Jem said he didn't care about family history, that he just wanted Atticus to be Atticus. I nodded, thinking of Calpurnia's church, of how her world felt realer than Aunt Alexandra's stories. The trial was coming, and Maycomb was splitting, with some folks standing with Atticus and others turning away. The Radley place watched, silent as ever, and I wondered if Boo knew about the trial, if he heard the town's whispers from behind his shutters. Aunt Alexandra's presence changed our house. Her rule hung over us like a heavy curtain. She talked to neighbors, her voice bright, about the Finch's place in Maycomb, while I'd slip away, missing Dill and the games that used to fill our summers. Atticus was quieter, his evenings spent with law books, his eyes distant, and I felt the trial pulling him away, pulling all of us into something bigger than our street. Maycomb was a puzzle now, its pieces Calpurnia's church, Mrs. Dub's courage, Atticus's fight not, fitting together the way they used to. As the summer days stretched on, hot and restless, a new test was waiting. One that would bring the trial closer and show us the cost of standing up in a town that wanted to stay the same. As the heat grew and the trial loomed, Maycomb's tensions were about to spill over, pulling Jem and me into a night that would test Atticus's resolve and show us the strength of his heart, in a way we'd never forget. Summer had brought Aunt Alexandra into our home, her rules and talk of Finch family pride settling over us like a heavy quilt. Her insistence that Jem and I act like proper Finches, with me in dresses and Jem less wild, clashed with the Maycomb we knew, where Calpurnia's church had shown us a different kind of strength. Atticus was stretched thin, his days consumed by the Tom Robinson case, and the town's whispers about his defense were growing sharper, cutting through the humid air. Jem was pulling away, his silences deeper, and I felt caught between his world and mine, missing Dill and our old adventures. The Radley place stood quiet, its mysteries fading against the trial's shadow, but as the heat pressed down, a new storm was brewing, one that would bring an old friend back and pull us into a night we'd never forget. The summer days were long and sticky, the air thick with the smell of sun-baked earth and the drone of cicadas. Maycomb was restless, its streets buzzing with talk about Atticus and Tom Robinson. The words Negro and disgrace hissed in corners and on porches. I heard it at the store, where folks turned away when I passed, and at school, where kids repeated what their parents said, their eyes daring me to fight. I kept my promise to Atticus, mostly, my fists clenched, but still, though it was harder every day. Aunt Alexandra was a constant presence now, her voice sharp as she corrected my manners or told Jem to stand up straight. She'd sit on the porch, sipping tea, talking about family heritage, while I longed for the backyard, for the days when Jem, Dill and I chased Radley's secrets under the stars. One evening, as the sky turned purple and the fireflies began their dance, Jem and I were in the backyard, the grass warm under our feet. I was kicking at a stone, missing Dill, when I heard a rustle in the bushes. My heart jumped, thinking of Boo Radley, But then a familiar face popped out, grinning despite the dirt smudged on his cheeks. It was Dill, his hair wild, his clothes wrinkled like he'd been traveling for days. I shouted, throwing my arms around him, and Jem's face lit up, his moodiness gone for the first time in weeks. Dill told us he'd run away from Meridian, tired of his new stepfather and missing Maycomb. He'd hidden under our house, eating scraps Calpurnia left out, too scared to show himself until now. His story was wild, full of trains and stolen money. But I didn't care how he got here, just that he was back. We snuck Dill inside, hiding him in Jem's room, the air thick with the smell of dust and old books. Calpurnia found us, her eyes narrowing, but she didn't scold, just brought him a plate of cornbread and milk, her hands gentle as she brushed dirt from his hair. Atticus came home, his face tired but soft, when he saw Dill, and he called Miss Rachel, Dill's aunt, to let her know he was safe. Dill's story spilled out again, a mix of truth and his usual picture show flair. And Atticus listened, his eyes kind but serious. He said Dill could stay, but he'd have to face his mother later. That night, Dill slept in Jem's bed, and I lay awake, the moonlight spilling through my window, happy to have him back, but worried about what he'd run from, what it meant for our summer. The town's tension grew with the heat, the trial looming like a storm cloud. Aunt Alexandra approved of Dill, calling him a stray who'd lead us into trouble. But I didn't care, she couldn't stop our trio from reforming. We spent days in the backyard, plotting like old times. Though Jem was different, his eyes always drifting to the courthouse, his thoughts on Atticus and the trial. One night, after supper, when the air was heavy with the smell of jasmine and the crickets sang loudly, Jem told me he was going to check on Atticus. He'd seen him leave the house with a light bulb and an extension cord, heading toward town, and it didn't sit right. I argued, scared of the dark streets, but Dill was all in, his eyes bright with adventure, and I couldn't let them go alone. We crept through Maycomb, the streets, quiet, except for the hum of night sounds. The courthouse square, dark and empty. We found Atticus outside the jail, sitting under a single bulb, a book in his lap, the light casting shadows on his face. The jail was a small, ugly building, its bars glinting in the dim glow. And Atticus looked alone, like he was guarding something precious. Before we could call out, cars rolled up, their headlights cutting through the dark, and men stepped out, their voices low and rough. I recognized some farmers, shopkeepers, faces from Maycomb streets, but they looked different now, their eyes hard, their hands clenched. They told Atticus to step aside, that they wanted Tom Robinson, and I felt my stomach twist, knowing what they meant without understanding it all. I ran out from our hiding spot, my heart pounding, ignoring Jem's whisper to stay back. Dill followed, his breath quick, and Jem had no choice but to join us. I stood in front of Atticus, my voice shaking as I asked what they wanted. The men stared, their faces caught between surprise and anger, and one of them, Mr. Cunningham, looked at me, his eyes softening. I talked about his son, Walter, my classmate, about the hickory nuts he'd brought me, anything to fill the silence. Atticus's hand was on my shoulder, steady but firm, and he told the men to go home. Mr. Cunningham nodded, his voice low, and the men left, their cars fading into the night. Atticus wiped his glasses, his face pale, and I realized he'd been scared too, but he'd stood there, alone, for what was right. We walked home, the stars bright above, the air cool against my skin. Atticus didn't scold us, just said we shouldn't have come, but his hand squeezed mine, like he was glad we were there. Dill was quiet, his usual chatter gone, and Jem's face was set, like he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. The Radley place was dark as we passed, its shutters still, and I wondered if Boo had heard the commotion, if he knew what Atticus was facing. Maycomb was splitting open, its heart laid bare, and I felt it in my bones. The trial wasn't just Atticus's fight, it was ours too. The summer nights were long, but the days ahead would be longer, pulling us deeper into a town where courage and fear walked hand in hand. As the trial drew closer, its shadow over Maycomb grew darker, and a day in court was coming, one that would test Atticus's strength and show Jem and me the weight of truth in a town that wasn't ready for it. The summer had grown heavier. In Maycomb, the air thick with the trial's shadow and the town's divided heart. Dill's return from Meridian, bursting out of the bushes like a spark of our old adventures, had lifted our spirits, but Jem's growing distance and Aunt Alexandra's rules kept us on edge. The night at the jail had shaken us. Atticus, sitting alone under a single bulb, facing a mob of men who wanted Tom Robinson, and my impulsive words about Walter Cunningham turning them away. The Radley place, with its quiet mysteries, felt far away now, its shutters no match for the storm brewing in Maycomb's streets. As the trial drew closer, the tension tightened like a rope, pulling Atticus, Jem, and me into a moment that would show us the cost of standing up in a town ready to break. July in Maycomb was a furnace, the sun baking the red dirt roads until they shimmered, the air heavy with the scent of wilting magnolias and the drone of flies. The town was restless, its usual sleepy rhythm replaced by a hum of unease, like the buzz before a thunderstorm. Folks gathered in clumps at the store or the courthouse steps, their voices low, their eyes sharp when they saw Atticus. He was busier than ever, his days spent in meetings with men in suits, his nights buried in papers, the lamp in his study burning late. Aunt Alexandra watched him, her lips tight, saying he was bringing trouble on us all. But I could see the worry in her eyes, too, hidden behind her talk of family pride. Jem was quieter, his 12-year-old mind wrestling with things he wouldn't share. And Dill and I trailed him, trying to hold on to the summer we used to know. One evening, as the sky turned a deep orange, and the crickets began their song, a group of men came to our house, their boots heavy on the porch. I recognized Mr. Heck Tate, the sheriff, and Mr. Link Dees, who owned the Cotton Gin, along with others from town, their faces serious under their hats. They stood in the living room, their air thick with the smell of tobacco and sweat, and talked to Atticus about the trial. They said, the old Sarum bunch, a rough crowd from the north of the county, might cause trouble, that Tom Robinson wasn't safe in the jail. Atticus nodded, his voice calm but firm, saying he'd handle it, that he wouldn't let anything happen to Tom. I listened from the hallway, my heart thumping, and saw Jem's face go pale, his eyes fixed on Atticus like he was trying to understand something bigger than us. The next day, Sunday, was quiet. The town washed under the weight of what was coming. Atticus was gone most of the day, and Aunt Alexandra kept us busy with chores, her voice sharp as she told me to stop scuffing my shoes. Dill tried to lighten the mood, spinning tales of his escape from Meridian, but even he was subdued, his eyes flicking to the courthouse whenever we passed it. That night, after supper, when the air was warm and the stars glittered above, Jem said he was going to check on Atticus again. He'd seen him leave with that light bulb and extension cord, just like before, and it didn't sit right, I argued, my stomach twisting at the thought of another night in the dark. But Dill's grin was back, and I couldn't let them go without me. We slipped out, the streets silent except for the soft crunch of gravel under our feet. Maycomb at night was a different place, its houses dark, the courthouse square empty except for shadows that seemed to move on their own. We found Atticus at the jail again, sitting under that single bulb, his chair propped against the door, a book open in his lap. The light cast long shadows, making his face look older, more tired, but his posture was steady, like he was rooted to the spot. We hid in the alley, our breaths quick, watching as cars pulled up, their headlights slicing through the dark. Men stepped out, the same ones from the other night. It's farmers, workers, their faces hard, their voices rough with drink and anger. They told Atticus to move, that they'd come for Tom Robinson. And I felt the air tighten, like a storm about to break. I couldn't stay hidden. I ran out, my shoes slapping the pavement, ignoring Jem's hissed warning. Dill and Jem followed, their shadows mixing with mine in the dim light. I stood in front of Atticus, my voice shaking as I faced the men, their eyes glinting like wolves. In the dark, I saw Mr. Cunningham again, his hat low, and I talked about his son, Walter, about school, about anything to fill the silence. The men shifted, their hands unclenching, and Mr. Cunningham looked at me, his face softening, like he saw his own boy in my words. Atticus's hand was on my shoulder, warm and steady, and he told the men to go home. His voice quiet but unyielding. One by one, they turned away, their cars rumbling off, leaving the night still again. Atticus wiped his face, his glasses fogging, and I saw the sweat on his brow. The way his hands trembled just a little. He didn't scold us, just said we shouldn't have come, but his eyes were soft, like he was grateful in a way he couldn't now. Jem was quiet, his face pale, and Dill's usual chatter was gone, his eyes wide as he looked at Atticus. We walked home, the stars bright above, the Radley place dark and silent as we passed. I thought about Boo, about whether he'd seen us, whether he knew what Atticus was risking. The jail confrontation wasn't just about Tom, it was about Maycomb, about what the town was becoming. and I felt it in my chest. A mix of pride and fear for Atticus. For us. Back home, Aunt Alexandra was waiting, her face tight with worry, but she didn't say much, just sent us to bed. I lay awake, the moonlight spilling through my window, thinking about Atticus alone at the jail, about the men who'd come for Tom, about how my words had stopped them, even if I didn't know why. Jem sat on his bed, his knees pulled up, and said Atticus was brave, braver than anyone, but he didn't know if it would be enough. Dill was asleep, his breathing soft, but I could tell he felt it. The weight of the trial, the way it was pulling Maycomb apart. The summer was almost gone, and the courthouse was waiting, ready to show us what truth and justice looked like in a town that wasn't sure it wanted either. As the trial day dawned, Maycomb was ready to spill its secrets, and the courtroom was calling, a place where Atticus's fight would unfold, and Jem, Dill and I would see the heart of our town laid bare. The summer had reached a boiling point. Maycomb streets crackling with the tension of Tom Robinson's trial. Atticus had faced a mob at the jail, his quiet strength holding them back. And my words about Walter Cunningham had somehow turned them away, leaving us shaken but proud. Dill's return had sparked our old trio, but Jem's growing distance, and Aunt Alexandra's rules kept us on edge. The Radley place, with its silent shutters and hidden gifts, felt like a distant memory now, overshadowed by the courthouse and the weight of what was coming. As the trial day dawned, Maycomb was a hive of anticipation, and Jem, Dill and I were about to step into the heart of it, seeing our town and Atticus in a light that would change us forever. The morning of the trial was hot, the air thick with the smell of dust and sweat, the sun already high as Maycomb came alive. The town square was buzzing, folks pouring in from every corner of the county, farmers in overalls, townspeople in their Sunday best, even the old Sarum bunch, their faces hard and sunburned. The courthouse loomed over it all, its columns white against the blue sky, its clock ticking steady, like it was counting down to something bigger than us. Atticus was already gone, his briefcase in hand, his suit pressed despite the heat. Aunt Alexandra was tight-lipped, her hands busy with breakfast dishes, muttering about the trouble Atticus was stirring. I felt a knot in my stomach, not just from the trial but from the way Maycomb looked at us, their eyes sharp and judging. Jem, Dill and I couldn't stay away. We slipped out after breakfast, the streets crowded with wagons and cars, the air alive with voices, some angry, some curious, all loud. The square was a carnival, with men spitting tobacco, women fanning themselves, and kids darting through the crowd, their laughter sharp against the tension. We pushed through, Jem leading the way, his eyes fixed on the courthouse like it was calling him. Dill's chatter was quieter now, his usual stories replaced by wide-eyed stares at the crowd. I felt small, my dress sticking to my skin, wishing for my overalls and the freedom to run. The courthouse steps were packed, folks spilling onto the lawn, and we couldn't get inside. Not through the main doors where the grown-ups stood guard. Jem had an idea, his voice low, as he pulled us toward the side of the courthouse. We found Reverend Sykes, from Calpurnia's church, standing near a back entrance, his face calm but his eyes watchful. He recognized us, his smile warm, and said we could sit with him in the colored balcony, where there was room. I hesitated, remembering Lula's glare at first purchase, but Reverend Sykes's nod was firm, and we followed him up the narrow stairs, the wood creaking under our feet. The balcony was crowded, the air heavy with the smell of sweat and starched clothes. But the people made space, their faces kind, some nodding like they knew us. We squeezed onto a bench, the wood warm against my legs, and looked down at the courtroom, a sea of heads below us, the judge's bench high and solemn. The courtroom was alive, voices murmuring like a restless wind, the air thick with heat and expectation. Atticus sat at a table below, his back straight, his papers neatly stacked, looking small but steady against the crowd. Tom Robinson was there too, in a chair by Atticus, his shoulders hunched, his face turned away from the staring eyes. I couldn't see his expression, but I felt his presence, heavy and quiet, like a shadow over the room. The jury was a line of men, their faces familiar, farmers, shopkeepers, men I'd seen in Maycomb's streets, but they looked different now, stiff in their suits, their eyes fixed on the judge. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the railing, trying to understand what was happening, what Atticus was fighting for. The trial hadn't started yet, but the room was electric, every whisper and shuffle loud in my ears. Jem's eyes were bright, his hands clenched, like he was trying to hold on to every word, every moment. Dill leaned close, his breath quick, asking questions I didn't know how to answer. Reverend Sykes sat beside us, his voice low, as he explained the judge, the lawyers, the rules of the court. But his words blurred in my mind, drowned out by the weight of it all. I thought about Atticus at the jail, his book and bulb against the mob, and felt a surge of pride, mixed with fear, knowing he was standing alone again, this time in front of the whole town. Outside, the square was still buzzing, the crowd growing, as more folks arrived, their voices carrying through the open windows. I heard snatches of talk about Tom, about Atticus, about what the trial meant for Maycomb. Some said it was justice, others said it was trouble, and I felt the split in the town, like a crack in the earth. The balcony was a different world, the faces around us tired but hopeful, their eyes on Tom like he was one of their own. I thought about Calpurnia, about her church, about the collection for Helen, and wondered what she'd make of this. Of us sitting here, watching her world, and ours collide. Atticus looked up once, his eyes scanning the balcony, and I wondered if he saw us, if he knew we were there. His face didn't change, but I felt a connection, like he was carrying us with him, just as he carried Tom's case. The judge called the court to order, his gavel sharp, and the room hushed, the air thick with waiting. I held my breath, my hands sweaty on the railing, knowing this was the start of something that would mark Maycomb forever. Jem leaned forward, his face set, and Dill's hand found mine, small but firm. We were here, witnesses to Atticus's fight, and I felt the weight of it. The way it was shaping us, shaping Maycomb, in ways we couldn't yet see. As the trial began, the courthouse became a stage, and Atticus was ready to speak, his words, a light in the darkness of Maycomb's doubts, pulling Jem, Dill, and me into a story of truth and justice that would test everything we knew. The trial of Tom Robinson had pulled Maycomb into the courthouse. Its square, alive with the hum of anticipation, like a storm about to break. Jem, Dill, and I had found a place in the colored balcony, thanks to Reverend Sykes, looking down on Atticus as he sat steadily and alone, defending a man the town had already judged. The courtroom was a sea of faces, some curious, some angry, all waiting for the truth to unfold or for their version of it to win. The Radley place, with its quiet mysteries, was far from my mind now, replaced by the weight of what we were witnessing. As the trial began, the air grew thick with heat and tension, and Jem, Dill, and I leaned in, ready to see Atticus fight for justice in a town that wasn't sure it wanted it. The courthouse was stifling, the air heavy with the smell of sweat, starched collars, and old wood polish. The windows were open, letting in the faint buzz of flies and the distant hum of the crowd outside. But no breeze stirred the room. From the balcony, I could see every corner of the courtroom, the judge's bench, high and stern, the jury's row of sunburned faces, and Atticus at his table, his suit neat despite the heat, his papers stacked like a shield. Tom Robinson sat beside him, his head bowed, his hands still, and I felt a pang, seeing him so quiet against the room's restless energy. Jem's eyes were bright, his hands gripping the railing, and Dill leaned close, his breath quick, asking what would happen next. Reverend Sykes sat beside us, his face calm but his eyes sharp, watching the scene below like he knew its weight. The trial started with a hush, the judge's gavel sharp against the murmur of voices. Mr. Gilmer, the prosecutor, called Sheriff Heck Tate to the stand first, and the room leaned forward, the air thick with waiting. Heck Tate was a familiar figure in Maycomb, tall and broad, his boots scuffed from years of walking the county's roads. He took the stand, his hat in his hands, his voice steady but slow, like he was choosing each word with care. Mr. Gilmer asked him about the night of the alleged crime, and Heck told the story, how he'd been called to the UL place, out by the dump, where Myella UL claimed she'd been attacked. He said he found her bruised and shaken, her face marked, her voice trembling as she pointed to Tom Robinson as the man who'd done it. The courtroom was silent, every word landing like a stone, and I felt my stomach twist, trying to picture it, to understand what had happened. Jem whispered that Heck's story sounded rehearsed, like he'd told it 100 times, and I nodded, though I wasn't sure what it meant. Atticus stood to question him, his voice calm, his glasses glinting in the light. He asked if Heck had called a doctor, and Heck admitted he hadn't, that it didn't seem necessary. Atticus pressed, his questions sharp but polite, asking about Myella's injuries, bruises on her face, marks on her neck, and whether they'd been appropriately examined. Heck shifted, his hands tightening on his hat, and said he'd seen what he needed to see. Atticus's face didn't change. but I saw a flicker in his eyes, like he was building something, piece by piece. The balcony was quiet, the folks around us leaning forward, their faces tense, and I felt their hope, their fear, mixing with mine. Next came Bob Ewell, Maella's father, and the air in the courtroom shifted. Like a cloud passing over the sun, Bob Ewell was a wiry man, his clothes dirty, his hair slick with grease, his eyes darting like he was hunting something. He took the stand with a swagger, his voice loud and rough, like he was proud to be there. Mr. Gilmer led him through his story, and Bob said he'd come home that evening, heard Mayella screaming, and saw Tom Robinson attacking her through the window. He said he ran inside, chased Tom off, and found Mayella hurt, crying, her face bruised and her neck marked. His words were fast, almost eager, and I felt a chill. Not just from the story, but from the way he told it, like he was playing a part. Atticus stood again, his movements slow, deliberate, like a man walking through a storm. He asked Bob to describe the night again, and Bob repeated his story, his voice louder, his hands waving. Atticus's questions were gentle at first, then sharper, asking about the exact time, the light in the room, the marks on Maella's face. He wondered if Bob was sure it was Tom, if he'd seen clearly, and Bob snapped back, his face red, saying he knew what he saw. Then Atticus asked him to write his name, and Bob did, his hand clumsy but quick, using his left hand. The courtroom murmured, and Jem gripped my arm, whispering that it meant something, though I didn't understand what. Atticus sat down, his face calm, but I could tell he'd planted a seed, something the jury would have to think about. From the balcony, I watched the faces below, some nodding, some frowning, all caught in the story unfolding. The jury looked tired, their eyes flicking from Bob to Atticus to Tom, like they were trying to piece it together. Tom sat still, his head still bowed, and I wondered what he was thinking, what it felt like to have Maycomb's eyes on him. Dill was fidgeting, his hands twisting, and he whispered that Bob Ewell scared him, that there was something wrong about him. I nodded, feeling it too, a kind of darkness in Bob's voice, his swagger, that didn't match the quiet man beside Atticus. Reverend Sykes leaned over, his voice low, saying we'd see more soon, that Atticus wasn't done. The courthouse was a pressure cooker now, the heat and the words pressing down, making it hard to breathe. Outside, the square was still crowded, the hum of voices carrying through the windows, some cheering, some muttering, all waiting for the trial to tip one way or another. I thought about Atticus and Thejau, his book and bulb against the mob, and saw that same strength here, in the way he asked questions, the way he stood alone for Tom. Jem's face was set, his eyes bright with something like pride, and I felt it, too, a fierce love for Atticus, for what he was trying to do, even if I didn't understand it all. As the testimony ended for the day, the courtroom buzzed, folks shifting in their seats, their voices rising like a wave. The judge called a recess, and I leaned back, my hands sweaty on the railing, my heart racing. Atticus gathered his papers, his movements slow, and I wondered what he saw when he looked at the jury. At Bob Ewell, at Tom. The trial was just beginning, and Maycomb was watching, its heart split open, waiting for the next voice to speak, the next truth to unfold. As the courtroom cleared, and the heat of the day lingered, Mayella Ewell was waiting, her story ready to challenge Atticus's fight, pulling Jem, Dill, and me deeper into the battle for justice in a town struggling to face itself. The trial of Tom Robinson had gripped Maycomb, the courthouse, a cauldron of heat and tension, as Sheriff Heck Tate and Bob Ewell took the stand, their stories painting a picture of violence that pointed at Tom. Atticus's questions, sharp and steady, had chipped away at their words, especially when Bob Ewell wrote with his left hand, a detail that made Jem's eyes light up with hope. From the colored balcony, Jem, Dill, and I watched, our hearts tied to Atticus's fight, the air thick with the town's judgment. The Radley place, with its silent shutters, was a world away now, its mysteries no match for the drama unfolding. Below, as the trial pressed on, a new witness was about to take the stand, her words ready to challenge Atticus's truth and pull us deeper into Maycomb's divided soul. The courtroom was a furnace, the air heavy with the smell of sweat, dust, and the faint tang of ink from the court recorder's pen. The windows let in slants of sunlight, but they did nothing to cool the room, where every seat was filled, every eye fixed on the judge's bench. From the balcony, I could see Atticus below, his suit still neat, despite the heat, his hands calm. As he adjusted his glasses, Tom Robinson sat beside him, his shoulders hunched, his face turned away from the crowd, like he was trying to make himself smaller. Jem leaned forward, his hands tight on the railing, whispering that Atticus was building something, a case that could turn the jury. Dill was quieter, his eyes wide, his usual chatter swallowed by the weight of the room. Reverend Sykes sat beside us, his face steady but his fingers tapping, like he was holding on to hope and fear at once. The judge called Mayella Ewell to the stand, and the courtroom hushed, the air tightening like a drawn bow. Mayella was 19, small and thin, her dress clean but worn, her hair pulled back in a tight braid. She looked fragile, like a bird caught in a storm, but her eyes were sharp, darting from the judge to Mr. Gilmer to the crowd. Mr. Gilmer, the prosecutor, spoke gently, guiding her through her story. She said she'd been on the porch that evening, fetching water, when Tom Robinson passed by. She asked him to chop some kindling, invited him inside, and then, she said, he attacked her, hitting her face, grabbing her neck, leaving her bruised and scared. Her voice was soft at first, then louder, breaking with sobs, and the courtroom leaned in. Some faces softening, others nodding like they'd heard enough to judge. I watched Mayella, my stomach twisting, trying to see the truth in her words. Her story matched her father's, but there was something off, like a song played out of tune. Jem whispered that she seemed scared, not just of Tom, but of the whole room. And I wondered what it was like to live in that house by the dump, with Bob Ewell for a father. Dill fidgeted, his hands twisting, saying he felt sorry for her. But Reverend Sykes hushed him, his voice low, saying pity wouldn't help Tom now. The balcony was tense, the folks around us quiet, their eyes fixed on Mayella, some with sympathy, others with doubt, and I felt their weight. Their lives tied to this trial, in ways I couldn't fully grasp. Atticus stood to cross-examine, his voice calm, almost kind, like he was talking to a neighbor over coffee. He asked Mayella about her life, her family, her chores. His words slow and gentle, like he was peeling back layers. She answered at first, her voice sharp, saying she looked after her siblings, that her father was good enough when he wasn't. Drinking, but Atticus's questions grew sharper, asking about the night, about where her siblings were, about why no one heard her scream. Mayella's face reddened, her hands twisting in her lap, and she snapped back, saying she didn't have to answer, that Atticus was mocking her. The courtroom stirred, voices murmuring, and I saw the jury shift, their eyes narrowing, like they were weighing her anger against her tears. Atticus didn't flinch, his voice steady as he asked about her injuries, about whether Tom had hit her with his left hand or his right. Mayella hesitated, her eyes flicking to her father in the crowd, and said she didn't remember, that it happened too fast. Atticus asked about Tom's arm, and I remembered, Tom's left arm was crippled, useless from a childhood accident, something everyone in Maycomb knew. The room went quiet, the air heavy with the question. Atticus didn't ask outright. How could Tom have done what she said with only one good arm? Mayella's voice broke, her words tumbling out, accusing Atticus of tricking her. And the judge had to call for order, his gavel sharp against the rising voices. Jem's face was bright, his whisper urgent. He said Atticus had her now, that the jury had to see the holes in her story. Dill wasn't so sure, his eyes on Mayella, saying she looked scared, like she was trapped in her own words. I didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to believe Atticus, that Tom couldn't have done it, but Mayella's tears were real, her fear filling the room like smoke. Reverend Sykes leaned over, his voice low, saying it wasn't over, that Atticus was just starting. The balcony was a mix of hope and tension, the folks around us whispering, their faces tight, like they'd seen trials like this before and knew how they could end. Outside, the square was still alive, the crowd's voices carrying through the windows, some angry, some curious, all waiting for the next piece of the puzzle. I thought about Atticus at the jail, his book and bulb against the mob, and saw that same quiet strength here. In the way he stood, the way he asked questions that cut without drawing blood. The jury watched, their faces unreadable, and I wondered what they saw when they looked at Mayella, at Tom, at Atticus. The courtroom was a battlefield now, not of fists but of words, and Atticus was fighting for something bigger than himself, something Maycomb wasn't ready to face. As Mayella stepped down, her eyes avoiding Tom's, the courtroom buzzed, the air electric with what had been said and what was still to come. The judge called the next witness, and I leaned forward, my hands sweaty, knowing Tom's voice was next, that his story would test Maycomb's heart in a way nothing else could. As the trial pushed on, Tom Robinson was about to speak, his truth ready to challenge the town's beliefs, pulling Jem, Dill, and me into a moment that would show us the cost of justice in a world full of shadows. Asterisk, the trial had turned Maycomb's courthouse into a crucible, with Mayella Ewell's tearful testimony painting Tom Robinson as a threat, her words heavy with fear and anger. Atticus's questions, but piercing, had exposed cracks in her story, especially Tom's crippled arm, which couldn't have caused the injuries she described. From the colored balcony, Jem, Dill, and I watched, our hearts tied to Atticus's fight, the air thick with the town's judgment and our own hope. The Radley place, with its silent mysteries, was a faint echo now, drowned out by the courtroom's drama. As Mayella stepped down, the trial was far from over, and a new voice was about to rise, one that would challenge Maycomb's heart and pull Jem, Dill, and me deeper into the struggle for truth. The courtroom was a furnace, the air heavy, with the smell of sweat, dust, and the faint creak of wooden benches under the weight of the crowd. The open windows let in the hum of the square outside, where folks still gathered, their voices a restless murmur, but inside, all eyes were on the judge's bench. From the balcony, I could see Atticus below, his suit still crisp, despite the heat, his hands steady as he prepared his notes. Tom Robinson sat beside him, his head no longer bowed, his eyes meeting the crowd for the first time, dark and steady. Jem leaned forward, his hands tight on the railing, whispering that this was it, the moment Atticus would show the jury the truth. Dill was quieter, his eyes wide, his usual chatter lost in the room's tension. Reverend Sykes sat beside us, his face calm but his fingers clasped tight, like he was praying for what was coming. The judge called Tom Robinson to the stand, and the courtroom went still, the air thick with waiting. Tom stood, his movements slow, his left arm hanging useless. At his side, a reminder of the accident that had mangled it years ago. He took the oath, his voice low but clear, and sat, his eyes fixed on Atticus like he was a lifeline. Atticus began, his voice gentle, asking Tom about his life, his work in the fields, his family, his days in Maycomb. Tom spoke softly, saying he was 25, married with 3 children, a worker who picked cotton and did odd jobs. He said he'd passed the Ewell place often, that Mayella sometimes asked for help chopping wood, carrying water, small tasks he did out of kindness, never expecting pay. The courtroom listened, some faces softening, others hardening, and I felt the weight of their stares, like they were measuring Tom against Mayella's tears. Atticus asked about the night in question, and Tom's voice stayed steady, though his hands trembled slightly. He said Mayella had called him inside to fix a door, but when he got there, the door was fine. She asked him to reach for something on a high shelf, and as he stood on a chair, she grabbed him, kissed him, and said she'd never kissed a man before. Tom said he tried to leave, scared of what it meant, but Mayella blocked the door. And then Bob Ewell appeared, shouting threats, his face red with rage. Tom ran, he said, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he knew what it looked like, a black man in a white woman's house. His voice broke, not with fear, but with truth, and I felt my chest tighten, believing him, wanting the jury to believe him, too. Mr. Gilmer, the prosecutor, stood to cross-examine, his voice sharp, his eyes cold. He pressed Tom, asking why he helped Mayella so often, suggesting he had other motives, that he wanted something from her. Tom's face stayed calm, but his eyes flickered, and he said he felt sorry for her, living out there with no one to help. The courtroom gasped, the word sorry like a spark in dry grass. And Mr. Gilmer pounced, saying a black man had no business feeling sorry for a white woman, that it was proof of his guilt. Tom shook his head, his voice steady, saying he only meant to help, that he'd done nothing wrong. But Mr. Gilmer's words were like a whip, cutting through the room, and I saw the jury shift, their faces closing off, like they'd heard all they needed. Jem's hands were shaking now. His whisper fierce, he said Tom was telling the truth, that Atticus had shown it, that the jury had to see it. But Dill was different, his face pale, his eyes wet. He said he couldn't stand it, the way Mr. Gilmer talked to Tom, like he was less than human. Reverend Sykes tried to hush him, but Dill was trembling, his breath quick, and I felt it too, a sick feeling in my stomach, like the room was closing in. Reverend Sykes nodded to me, and I took Dill outside, down the courthouse steps, the air cooler but heavy with the smell of dust and tobacco from the crowd. We sat under an oak tree, the shade a slight relief, and Dill cried, his words tumbling out. How could they treat Tom like that? How could Maycomb be so cruel? I didn't have answers, just sat with him, my hand on his shoulder, feeling the trials. weight settle over us like a storm. Scout Finch, sitting under that oak, I thought about Atticus, about his calm questions, about Tom's steady voice against Mr. Gilmer's sneers. The square was still alive, folks talking in knots, some pointing at the courthouse, others at us, like we carried Atticus's fight on our faces. I wondered what Calpurnia would say, what she'd make of Tom's words, of Dill's tears. The Bradley place was far away, its mysteries small compared to this, but I thought of Boo, wondering if he'd ever seen a trial, if he knew what Maycomb was capable of. Jem was still inside, watching, believing in Atticus, and I wanted to think, too. But Dill's tears made me doubt, made me see the town's heart in a new, sharper light. As we sat there, the trial continued inside, Atticus's voice a beacon, in the storm of Maycomb's judgment, and another voice was waiting, one that would push the courtroom closer to its verdict, testing the town's soul and our own hope. As the trial's heat pressed on, Atticus was ready to speak again, his words a final stand for truth, pulling Jem, Dill, and me into a moment that would show us the power of courage in a town struggling to listen. The trial had reached a fever pitch, with Tom Robinson's steady testimony laying bare a truth that clashed with Myella Yule's tears and Bob Yule's venom. Atticus's questions had exposed the impossibility of Tom's guilt, his crippled arm a silent witness against the Yule story. But Mr. Gilmer's harsh words had stung, turning Tom's kindness into something sinister in the jury's eyes. From the colored balcony, Jem believed in Atticus's fight, but Dill's tears under the oak tree showed the trial's cruelty, leaving me caught between hope and doubt. The Radley place, with its quiet mysteries, was a distant memory now, lost in the courthouse's heat and Maycomb's judgment. As the trial neared its close, Atticus was ready to make his final stand, and a strange encounter outside would show us a side of Maycomb we hadn't seen, pulling us deeper into the battle for truth. The courthouse was a sweltering box, the air thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and the faint rustle of paper fans. The windows let in slants of late sun, painting the walls gold, but the heat was relentless, pressing down on the crowd packed into every corner. From the balcony, I could see Atticus below, his suit still neat, his glasses glinting as he prepared his notes. Tom Robinson sat beside him, his face calm but his eyes distant, like he was bracing for what was coming. Jem leaned forward, his hands tight on the railing, whispering that Atticus had the jury now, that Tom's truth was clear. Dill was back, his eyes red but steady, sitting close to me, his shoulder brushing mine. Reverend Sykes watched in silence, his face a mask of hope and worry. The weight of the trial heavy on everyone in the balcony. Before the closing arguments, the judge called a brief recess, and the courtroom stirred, voices rising like a swarm of bees. Jem wanted to stay, his eyes fixed on Atticus, but Dill and I needed air, the heat and tension too much. We slipped down the stairs, the wood creaking under our feet, and stepped into the square, where the crowd milled about, their voices a mix of anger and curiosity. The air outside was warm but fresher, carrying the scent of cut grass and tobacco. We wandered toward the shade of an oak, and there, leaning against the tree, was Mr. Dolphus Raymond, a man Maycomb whispered about. He was rich, from an old family, but lived with a black woman and their mixed-race children, drinking from a paper sack that folks said held whiskey. His hat was tipped back, his eyes sharp but kind, and he offered Dill a sip from his sack, saying it'd settle his stomach. Dill took a cautious sip, his eyes widening when he realized it was just Coca-Cola, not liquor. Mr. Raymond grinned, his voice low, and said he let folks think he was a drunk because it was easier than explaining why he lived the way he did. He said Maycomb didn't understand folks who didn't fit their mold, who saw people as people, not colors. I listened, my mind spinning, thinking of Calpurnia's church, of Tom on the stand, of how Maycomb's rules seemed to choke anyone who stepped outside them. Dill nodded, his face softer, like Mr. Raymond's words had eased something in him. I felt it, too, a kind of clarity, like seeing Maycomb from a new angle, its heart both cruel and complicated. We headed back to the courthouse, the square buzzing. Behind us, Mr. Raymond's sack crinkling as he waved us off. Back in the balcony, the courtroom was settling, the air thick with anticipation, as Atticus stood for his closing argument. He took off his coat, loosened his tie, and stepped to the center of the room. His voice clear and strong, like a river cutting through stone. He spoke of justice, of the law that said every man deserved a fair trial, no matter his color. He went over the evidence, Tom's crippled arm, the Yule's shaky story, The lack of a doctor's report said there was no proof Tom had done what they claimed. Only prejudice that painted him guilty before he spoke. He talked about Mayella, not with anger but with pity, saying she was lonely, trapped by her father's cruelty and the town's expectations, but that her lie couldn't stand against the truth. His words were steady, his eyes meeting the jury's, asking them to do what was right, to see Tom as a man, not a shadow of Maycomb's fears. The courtroom was silent, every word landing like a pebble in still water, ripples spreading through the crowd. From the balcony, I felt my heart swell, pride for Atticus, mixing with fear that his words wouldn't be enough. Jem's eyes were bright, his hands clenched, whispering that Atticus had done it, that the jury had to listen. Dill was quiet, his face still, but his hand found mine, squeezing tight, like he was holding onto Atticus's hope. Reverend Sykes leaned forward, his breath slow, and I saw the folks around us, their faces tense, some nodding, others staring hard, like they were wrestling with what they'd heard. Atticus finished, his voice low, saying the jury held Tom's life in their hands, that they could choose justice or let prejudice win. He sat down, his shoulders straight, and I saw Tom look at him, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. The square outside was still alive, the crowd's voices carrying through the windows, some shouting, some whispering, all waiting for the jury to decide. I thought about Mr. Raymond, his Coca-Cola secret, and how he'd chosen to live outside Maycomb's rules, paying a price for it. I thought about Atticus, standing alone in the courtroom, just as he had at the jail. His book and bulb, now replaced by words that cut deeper than any rifle. The Radley place was far away, its mysteries small against this fight. But I wondered if Boo was watching, if he knew what Atticus was risking. The courtroom was a battlefield now, and Atticus had laid down his weapons, leaving the truth bare. For Maycomb to face Dart, as Atticus sat, the judge prepared to send the jury out. And the air grew heavy, the weight of the verdict looming over us. Jem, Dill, and I held our breath, knowing the next moments would show us what Maycomb was made of, what justice could mean in a town torn by its own heart. As the jury left to deliberate, the courthouse held its breath, and a wait began, one that would test Atticus's faith, Jem's hope, and Maycomb's soul, pulling us all toward a truth that might not set us free. The trial had reached its peak, with Atticus's closing argument ringing through the courthouse, his words a plea for justice that laid bare Maycomb's prejudice. Outside, Mr. Dolphus Raymond's Coca-Cola secret had shown us a man living outside the town's rules, his choice a mirror to Atticus's fight. From the colored balcony, Gem Washer Atticus had won, his hope bright as he watched the jury, while Dill and I felt the weight of Maycomb's judgment, our hearts torn between faith and fear. The Radley place, with its quiet mysteries, was a faint whisper now, drowned by the courtroom's tension. As the jury left to deliberate, the air grew heavy, and Jem, Dill, and I waited, knowing the verdict would show us Maycomb's heart. For better or worse, the courthouse was a furnace, the air thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and the faint rustle of paper fans, now slowing as the crowd grew still. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, but the heat clung to us, heavy and unrelenting. From the balcony, I could see Atticus below, his hands folded, his face calm but his eyes distant, like he was carrying the weight of the trial alone. Tom Robinson sat beside him, his head bowed, his crippled arm a silent testament to the truth he'd told. Jem leaned forward, his hands gripping the railing, his whisper urgent. He said the jury couldn't take long, that Atticus's words had been too clear, too actual. Dill sat close, his eyes red from earlier tears, his fingers twisting in his lap, and I felt his unease, like a storm brewing in my own chest. Reverend Sykes leaned over, his voice low, warning us not to get our hopes up, that juries in Maycomb had their own way of seeing things. His words stung, but I pushed them away, wanting to believe Jem, wanting Atticus's truth to win. The courtroom was quiet now, the crowd's murmurs fading as folks settled in to wait, some fanning themselves, others staring at the empty jury box. Outside, the square was still alive, the hum of voices carrying through the windows, a mix of anticipation and anger that made my skin prickle. I thought about Mr. Raymond, his paper sack, and his choice to live outside Maycomb's rules, and wondered if Atticus felt that same loneliness, standing for what was right in a town that didn't want to hear it. The wait stretched on, the clocks ticking loud in the silence, each second heavy with what might come. Jem kept whispering, going over Atticus's Pointstam's arm, Mayella's shaky story, The lack of evidence, like he was trying to convince himself it was enough. Dill was quieter, his eyes on the floor, and I could tell he was thinking about Mr. Gilmer's sneers, about how Tom's kindness had been twisted into something ugly. I looked at the folks around us in the balcony, their faces tense, some praying softly, their hands clasped tight. They believed in Tom, in Atticus, but their eyes held a kind of knowing, like they'd seen this before, like they feared what was coming. I wanted to ask Reverend Sykes what he meant, but my throat was tight, my hands sweaty on the railing. The judge sent us home for supper, saying the jury was still out, and the courtroom emptied slowly, folks moving like they were underwater, heavy with waiting. We walked home through the square, the air cooler now, the sky a deep purple, streaked with stars. Aunt Alexandra was waiting, her face tight, her hands busy with dishes. But she didn't scold us, just set out plates of cornbread and greens. Atticus was there, his tie loosened, his eyes tired but kind. He didn't talk about the trial, just asked about our day, and I saw Jem struggle to stay quiet, his questions about the jury burning in his eyes. Dill ate little, his fork pushing food around, and I felt the same. My stomach knotted. The trial filling every corner of our house. After supper, we begged to go back, and Atticus nodded, his voice soft, saying we could if we wanted. The square was quieter now, the crowd thinner, but the air was still heavy, the courthouse glowing under the streetlights. We climbed back to the balcony, the stairs creaking, the smell of wax and sweat greeting us like an old friend. The courtroom was half empty, the remaining folks sitting in clusters, their faces drawn. Reverend Sykes made room for us, his nod warm but his eyes serious, and we settled in, the weight pressing down like a weight. Jem's hope was fading, his whispers slower, and Dill leaned against me, his breath uneven. I thought about Atticus in the jail, his book and bulb against the mob, and hoped his words could hold that same power here. The jury returned as the clock struck late, the courtroom snapping to life, voices rising like a wave. The men filed in, their faces blank, their eyes avoiding Atticus and Tom. The judge asked for the verdict, and the foreman stood, his voice flat, saying, "Guilty." The word hit like a stone, heavy and final, and I felt Jem flinch, his hands dropping from the railing. Dill's breath caught, his eyes wet again, and I sat frozen, my heart pounding, unable to believe it. Atticus gathered his papers, his movements slow, his face unchanged, but I saw the slump in his shoulders, the weight of defeat. Tom was led away, his head bowed, and the balcony stirred. Folks standing, their faces a mix of sorrow and anger, their respect for Atticus, silent but strong. But we stayed as the courtroom emptied, the air heavy with the verdict's echo. Reverend Sykes touched Jem's shoulder, saying it wasn't right, but it was Maycomb, and I saw tears in Jem's eyes, his hope shattered. Dill was quiet, his face pale, and I felt it, too, a kind of ache, like the town had let us down. Outside, the square was nearly empty, the stars bright above, and I thought of the Radley place, its shutters still, wondering if Boo knew what had happened, if he'd felt Maycomb's heart break. Atticus walked home ahead of us, his shadow long, and I wanted to run to him, to ask why, but my feet were heavy, my voice gone. Back home, the house was quiet, the air thick with the smell of coffee and the faint hum of crickets outside. Atticus sat at the kitchen table, his glasses off, his face tired but calm. He didn't speak of the verdict, but I saw it in his eyes, the cost of fighting a fight he knew he might lose. Jem sat across from him, his face hard, his voice breaking, as he asked how they could do it, how they could believe the Yules over Tom. Atticus's voice was soft, saying sometimes justice takes time, that Maycomb wasn't ready yet, but he'd keep fighting. I held Dill's hand, feeling his trembling, and thought of Mr. Raymond, of Calpurnia, of all the folks who lived in Maycomb's shadows, their truths ignored. As the night settled over Maycomb, the trial's wound was fresh, and the town was restless, its verdict a mirror to its soul. Jem, Dill, and I were changed, our eyes opened to a world where truth didn't always win. But Atticus's fight wasn't over, and neither was ours. The verdict had fallen, but Maycomb wasn't done with us, and a new day was coming, one that would show Jem's anger, the town's reaction, and the quiet strength of those who stood with Atticus, pulling us deeper into the heart of our town. The trial had ended with a single word, guilty, that struck like a hammer, shattering Jem's hope and leaving Dill and me stunned in the colored balcony. Atticus's fight for Tom Robinson, his calm words against the Yule's lies, hadn't been enough for Maycomb's jury. and the weight of their verdict hung over us as we walked home under the stars. The Radley place, with its quiet shutters, was a distant shadow now, its mysteries no match for the injustice we'd seen. Jem's tears and Atticus's tired eyes spoke of a town divided. And as the night settled over Maycomb, the trial's wound was raw, pulling us into a new day where Jem's anger and the town's reaction would show us the cost of standing for truth. The morning after the verdict was heavy, the air thick with the smell of dew and dust, the sun rising slowly over Maycomb rooftops. The house was quiet, the usual hum of breakfast replaced by a stillness that felt like morning. Jem sat at the kitchen table, his eyes red, his face hard, like he'd aged years in one night. Atticus was there, his coffee steaming, his suit replaced by a loose shirt, his face lined with exhaustion but calm. As always, Aunt Alexandra moved silently, her hands busy with dishes, but her eyes were soft, like she felt the verdict's weight. I sat next to Dill, his usual spark dim, his fork pushing eggs around his plate. The trial was over, but it was still with us, its echo in every glance, every quiet moment. Jem broke the silence, his voice sharp, asking how the jury could do it, how they could ignore Tom's truth and believe the you. Atticus sipped his coffee, his voice steady, saying it wasn't the jury's fault alone. That Maycomb's fears ran deep, that prejudice was a wall they weren't ready to climb. He said he'd known the odds, but he'd fought anyway. It was right, because someone had to. Jem's hands clenched, his words spilling out. How could Atticus stay so calm? How could he keep living in a town like this? I felt it, too, a burning in my chest, wanting to scream at Maycomb, at the faces in the courtroom who'd turned away from Tom. Dill was quiet, his eyes on Atticus, like he was searching for something to hold on to. Outside, Maycomb was waking, but it felt different, like the town was holding its breath. We stepped onto the porch, the air warm with the scent of honeysuckle and cut grass, and found a surprise piles of food stacked by the door, baskets of greens, sacks of pecans, jars of preserves. Calpurnia came out, her face soft, saying it was from folks who appreciated Atticus, who knew what he'd done for Tom. I thought of the balcony, of the people who'd stood as Atticus left the courtroom, their silent respect louder than the jury's verdict. Jem touched a basket, his voice low, saying it didn't make up for Tom. But I saw a flicker in his eyes, like he felt the town wasn't all lost. We walked into town, the square quieter now, the trial's crowd gone, leaving only the usual faces: shopkeepers, sweeping, older men on benches, their voices low as we passed. Some looked away, their eyes sharp with judgment. But others nodded, their faces kind, like they carried a piece of Atticus's fight. Miss Maudie called us over, her garden bright with flowers, the smell of baking drifting from her kitchen. She sat us on her porch, her voice warm but firm, saying Atticus wasn't alone, that there were folks in Maycomb who believed in him, who saw what he'd done. She said the verdict hurt, but every step toward justice counted, even if it felt small. Jem listened, his face still hard, but I saw him soften, like her words were a bandage on his wound. Dill spoke up, his voice small, asking why folks like Miss Maudie didn't serve on juries. Why it was only men like the ones who'd judged Tom. Miss Maudie smiled, a little sad, saying Maycomb wasn't ready for that. But change was coming. Slow as it was, I thought about Mr. Dolphus Raymond, his Coca-Cola secret, and how he'd chosen to live outside Maycomb's rules. I thought about Calpurnia, her strength bridging two worlds, and the folks who'd left food at our door. Maycomb was a puzzle, its pieces: prejudice, kindness, fear, hope not fitting together neatly. But Miss Maudie's words made me think there was something worth fighting for, even if Jem couldn't see it yet. Back home, the day stretched on, the heat pressing down, the air alive with cicadas and the faint hum of the town. Atticus was in his study, his papers spread out, already working on what came next for Tom. Jem sat on the porch, his air rifle across his lap, staring at the Radley place, its shutters still, its mysteries untouched by the trial's storm. I sat beside him, wanting to fix his hurt, but my words felt small, like they couldn't reach him. Dill joined us, his stories quiet for once, and we sat in silence, the verdict heavy between us. I wondered if Boo Radley knew about the trial, if he'd heard the town's whispers, if he'd seen Atticus stand alone. The town was restless, its verdict a wound that wouldn't close. We heard whispers of trouble, folks talking about Tom, about Atticus, about what might happen next. Aunt Alexandra was quieter, her rules softer, like she felt the trial's shadow, too. Calpurnia moved through the house, her face unreadable. But I saw her pause by Atticus's chair, her hand brushing his shoulder, a silent thank you for what he'd done. The food baskets sat in the kitchen, a reminder of the folks who stood with us. And I held on to that, even as Jem's anger burned, even as Dill's eyes stayed sad. As the day faded into evening, the stars bright above Maycomb, the trial's echo lingered, but a new challenge was coming, one that would test Atticus's strength again, and show Jem, Dill, and me what it meant to keep fighting in a town that wasn't ready to change. The verdict had left its mark, but Maycomb's story wasn't over, and a new day would bring talk of appeals, threats, and the quiet courage of those who stood with Atticus, pulling us deeper into the heart of our town's struggle. The trial's verdict had left a scar on Maycomb, with guilty echoing in our ears. As Jem's hope crumbled, and Dill's eyes filled with tears, Atticus's fight for Tom Robinson had moved some, shown by the food baskets left at our door, but the town's judgment stood firm. Its prejudice, a wall too high for truth to climb. Miss Maudie's words on her porch, about small steps toward justice, had given us a flicker of hope, but Jem's anger burned bright, his faith in Maycomb shaken. The Radley place, with its silent shutters, was a faint memory now, overshadowed by the trial's wound. As the summer days stretched on, the verdict's shadow lingered, and a new threat was rising, pulling Jem, Dill, and me deeper into Maycomb's restless heart. The air was thick with August heat. The smell of dust and wilting grass, heavy as Maycomb settled into the days after the trial. Our house felt quieter, the hum of routine broken by the weight of what we'd seen. Jem was different, his face hard, his eyes distant, like he was carrying the jury's decision in his chest. Atticus sat at the kitchen table, his coffee steaming, his glasses perched on his nose as he read the paper. But I could see the lines in his face, deeper now, etched by the trial's toll. Aunt Alexandra moved through the house, her rules softer, her voice gentler, like she felt the verdict's sting, too. Dill was still with us, his stories quieter, his eyes searching Jem's face, trying to understand his anger. I sat between them, my hands restless, wanting to fix what I couldn't name. Jem spoke up one morning, his voice sharp, asking Atticus how the jury could do it, how they could ignore Tom's truth and choose the Ewell's lies. Atticus sat down, his paper, his eyes soft but steady, and said it wasn't just the jury, it was Maycomb, its history, its fears. He explained how prejudice ran deep, how folks saw what they wanted to see, not what was true. He said Tom's case was strong, but a white jury would never take a black man's word over a white woman's, not in Maycomb, not yet. Jem's hands clenched, his voice breaking as he said it wasn't fair, that he didn't want to live in a place like this. Atticus nodded, his voice calm, saying change was slow, but every fight like this chipped away at the wall. Even if it didn't fall, I listened, my heart heavy, thinking of Tom in his cell, of the folks in the balcony hood, stood for Atticus. I asked if there was hope for Tom, and Atticus said they'd appeal, that there were still chances, but his eyes were tired, like he knew the odds. He talked about the jury, how one man, Cunningham, Walter's father, had held out for a while, wanting to acquit, and I remembered the night at the jail, my words about Walter turning the mob away. Atticus said that was progress, a sign Maycomb wasn't all lost, but Jem shook his head, saying it wasn't enough, that Tom was still guilty in their eyes. Dill was quiet, his fingers twisting a blade of grass, and I felt his sadness, like it was mine, too, a shared ache for what Maycomb had done. Outside, the town was moving on, its streets busy with the usual hum wagons creaking, kids playing, older men on benches spitting tobacco. But there was a new edge, whispers about Atticus, about Tom, about what might happen next. We walked to the post office, the air warm with the scent of honeysuckle and sun-baked dirt, and heard folks talking, some praising Atticus, others muttering he'd stirred trouble. Miss Stephanie Crawford stopped us, her eyes bright with gossip, saying Bob Ewell was spitting mad, that he'd cursed Atticus in the street, even spat in his face. She said Bob had sworn to get even, his voice loud with drink and hate, and I felt a chill, remembering his swagger on the stand, his eyes like knives. Atticus brushed it off when we told him, saying Bob was all talk, that his kind burned out, their anger fast. But Jem wasn't so sure, his face pale, his hands stuffed in his pockets, as we sat on the porch. The Radley place across the street, its shutters still and quiet. I thought about Boo, wondering if he'd heard about Bob Ewell, if he knew the trial's ripples were spreading. Dill tried to lighten the mood, spinning a half-hearted story about running away again, but his eyes kept drifting to Jem, like he was waiting for him to smile. I wanted to believe Atticus, that Bob's threat was empty, but the air felt heavier. Like a storm was brewing beyond the heat. Back home, Calpurnia was in the kitchen, her hands busy with supper, the smell of fried chicken and greens filling the air. She didn't talk about the trial, but I saw her pause when Atticus passed. Her eyes soft, like she was thanking him without words. Aunt Alexandra was quieter, too, her talk of Finch pride gone, replaced by a kind of respect for Atticus I hadn't seen before. Jem sat on the porch swing, his air rifle across his lap, staring at the stars, and I joined him, wanting to say something but not knowing what. He said he'd never understand Maycomb, that he wanted to be like Atticus, but didn't know if he could. Not after this. I thought about Miss Mowdy, about the food baskets, about the folks who'd stood in the balcony, and felt a spark of hope, small but stubborn. The day faded into evening, the cicadas loud, the air warm with the promise of summer's end. Maycomb was restless, its verdict a wound that wouldn't heal, and Bob Yule's threat hung over us, a shadow we couldn't shake. Atticus was in his study, his lamp burning late, working on Tom's appeal, his fight far from over. The Radley place watched, its mysteries untouched. But I felt its presence, like Boo was part of this, part of Maycomb's hidden heart. Jem, Dill, and I were caught in the trial's aftermath, our world sharper, harder, but still lit by quiet strength. As the summer waned, Maycomb's tensions simmered, and a new challenge was coming. One that would test Atticus's resolve, Jem's anger, and the town's fragile hope, pulling us deeper into the struggle for what was right. The trial's echo lingered, but a gathering was near, one that would bring new voices, new tests, and a chance to see Maycomb's heart through the eyes of those who stood apart, drawing us closer to the truth of our town. The trial's verdict had left Maycomb bruised, with Jem's faith in justice shattered, and Bob Yule's threat against Atticus hanging like a dark cloud. Atticus's talk of appeals and small steps toward change had given us a flicker of hope. But the town's whisper, some kind, some cruel, kept the wound fresh. The food baskets from those who stood with Atticus showed a side of Maycomb we hadn't expected, but Jem's anger and Dill's quiet sadness lingered, mirroring the town's unrest. The Radley place, with its silent shutters, was a distant echo now, its mysteries overshadowed by the trial's aftermath. As summer faded, a new gathering in our home would bring Maycomb's heart into focus, and a sudden tragedy would strike, pulling Jem, Dill, and me deeper into the cost of truth. August's heat clung to Maycomb, the air thick with the scent of sun-baked earth and wilting jasmine, the days long and heavy with the trial's shadow. Our house was a quiet haven, but Aunt Alexandra was determined to keep up appearances, her voice sharp as she planned a missionary circle meeting for the ladies of Maycomb. I was roped in, my overalls swapped for a dress that itched against my skin, my hair pinned up under Aunt Alexandra's watchful eye. Jem and Dill were banished to the backyard, their laughter faint through the open windows, and I envied them, stuck inside with teacups and talk of manners. Calpurnia was in the kitchen, her hands busy with trays of biscuits and lemonade, her face calm but her eyes distant, like she was carrying the trial's weight in her own way. The living room was transformed, the air filled with the clink of china and the murmur of voices as the ladies arrived, their hats bright and their dresses crisp despite the heat. Miss Mowdy was there, her smile warm but her eyes sharp, cutting through the polite chatter. Mrs. Merriweather led the talk, her voice loud as she spoke of the missionary work in Africa, of saving souls far away while ignoring the ones in Mockingbird. I stood by the tea table, my hands clumsy with the tray, listening to their words praise for Atticus, mixed with pity for his mistake in defending Tom. Whispers about the town's unrest, about how things should stay as they were. I felt my cheeks burn, wanting to shout, to tell them Atticus was right. But Aunt Alexandra's glance kept me quiet, her face tight with the effort of hosting. Miss Mowdy caught my eye, her nod slight but steady, like she knew what I was thinking. She spoke up, her voice gentle but firm, saying charity began at home, that Maycomb had its own souls to save. The room paused, some ladies nodding, others looking away, and I felt a spark of pride for her, for the way she stood up without raising her voice. I thought of the food baskets, of the folks in the balcony, and wondered how many of these ladies knew what Atticus had fought for, what Tom had lost. The air was heavy, not just with heat, but with the weight of their words, their blindness too. The town's heart. I wanted to be outside with Jem and Dill, away from the teacups and the talk that felt so far from the truth. Then Atticus came home, his face pale, his suit rumpled, and the room went still. the ladies' chatter fading like a dying breeze. He called for Aunt Alexandra and Calpurnia, his voice low, and I followed, my heart pounding, sensing something wrong. In the kitchen, he told us Tom Robinson was dead, shot trying to escape from prison. 17 bullets tearing through him as he climbed the fence. His voice was steady, but his eyes were dark, like the news had carved a new line in his face. Calpurnia's hands froze, her breath catching, and Aunt Alexandra sank into a chair, her face pale, her hands trembling. I stood frozen, the words sinking in Tom's quiet face on the stand flashing in my mind. His truth now silenced forever. Atticus said he had to go to Helen, Tom's wife, to tell her, and he asked Calpurnia to come with him. I wanted to go, to see Helen, to say something, but Aunt Alexandra shook her head, her voice soft, saying it wasn't my place. The ladies were still in the living room, their voices starting up again, unaware of the news, and Aunt Alexandra straightened, wiping her eyes, saying we had to go on, to serve the tea, to keep things normal. I looked at her, seeing a strength I hadn't noticed before, a kind of courage in her composure, like Atticus's, but different. Miss Modi took my hand, her grip warm, and we went back to the ladies, the air thick with the smell of perfume and biscuits, but all I could think of was Tom, of Helen, of the bullets that ended his fight. Jem and Dill came in from the backyard, their faces flushed from play, but when they saw my eyes, they stopped, their questions spilling out. I told them about Tom, my voice breaking, and Jem's face hardened, his fists clenched, like the verdict's wound had been ripped open again. Dill was quiet, his eyes wet, and I remembered his tears under the oak, his heart too soft for Maycomb's cruelty. We sat on the porch, the Radley place across the street, its shutters still, its silence a kind of witness to the town's pain. I wondered if Boo knew about Tom, if he'd heard the whispers, if he felt the town's heart breaking like we did. The missionary circle went on, the ladies' voices carrying through the windows, talking of far-off places while Maycomb's own wounds bled. Aunt Alexandra served tea, her smile fixed, and I tried to do the same, my dress itching, my hands clumsy. Miss Maudie stayed close, her presence steady, like she was holding us together. Atticus and Calpurnia were gone, off to face Helen's grief, and I imagined her, alone now, her children waiting for a father who'd never come home. The trial was over, but its shadow was long, and Bob Yule's threat still hung over us. A dark promise in a town that couldn't heal. As the ladies left, their hats bobbing in the evening light, Maycomb settled into a restless quiet, the air warm with the hum of cicadas and the faint glow of fireflies. Jem, Dill, and I sat on the porch, the weight of Tom's death heavy between us, our world sharper, harder, but still lit by Atticus's fight. The Radley place watched, its mysteries untouched, but I felt Boo's presence, like he was part of this, part of Maycomb's hidden heart. As summer's end loomed, Maycomb's pain was raw, and a new moment was coming, one that would show us the town's heart through small acts of kindness and the growing shadow of danger, pulling us deeper into the struggle to understand our home. The news of Tom's death spread, and Maycomb's response would reveal its soul, drawing Jem, Dill, and me closer to the truth of justice and the cost of courage in a town still divided. The trial's wound had deepened with Tom Robinson's death, shot 17 times while trying to escape. A tragedy that struck our home as Aunt Alexandra's missionary circle chattered on, unaware of the news. Atticus and Calpurnia had gone to tell Helen, leaving Jem, Dill, and me to grapple with the loss, our hearts heavy with Maycomb's cruelty. Aunt Alexandra's composure and Miss Modi's quiet strength had held us together. But the town's hypocrisy lingered, its polite talk masking the pain of Tom's fate. The Radley place, with its silent shutters, was a distant shadow now, its mysteries no match for the grief and anger we carried. As summer's end neared, Maycomb's response to Tom's death would reveal its heart, pulling Jem, Dill, and me deeper into the struggle to understand our town. September's heat was softer now, the air carrying the faint cool of coming fall, the smell of dry leaves mixing with the dust of Maycomb's streets. The town felt subdued, its usual hum quieter, like it was mourning in its own way. At home, Jem was still angry, his eyes dark, his voice sharp when he spoke of Tom, of the jury, of Maycomb's blindness. Dill was leaving soon, his suitcase packed, his stories quieter, his eyes holding a sadness that hadn't been there before the trial. I felt it too, a weight in my chest, like the town had taken something from us we couldn't name. Atticus was busier, his lamp burning late. working on papers for Tom's appeal that would never come, his face lined with the grief he didn't voice. Aunt Alexandra was gentler, her rules looser, like Tom's death had softened her edges. The news of Tom's death spread slowly, like ripples in a pond, and Maycomb's reaction was a mix of whispers and silence. We walked to town one morning, the air warm with the scent of cut grass and honeysuckle, and heard folks talking, some with pity, others with a shrug, saying Tom should have known better than to run. At the post office, Miss Stephanie Crawford was in her element, her voice loud as she spun the story, saying Tom had gone wild, that he'd been desperate, that it was proof of his guilt. I wanted to shout, to tell her Tom was scared, not guilty, but Jem's hand on my arm stopped me, his face tight, like he was fighting his own battle. Dill's eyes were down, his fingers twisting, and I knew he was thinking of Tom's quiet voice on the stand, of the truth Maycomb wouldn't hear. Back home, Atticus read us a piece from the Maycomb Tribune, written by Mr. Underwood, the editor who kept to himself but saw everything. He'd compared Tom's death to killing a songbird, something innocent and harmless, shot down for no reason but cruelty. His words were sharp, cutting through the town's excuses, and I felt a lump in my throat, thinking of Tom's family, of Helen's grief, of the 17 bullets that ended his hope. Atticus's voice was steady, but his eyes were wet, and I saw Jem nod, like Mr. Underwood's words had given shape to his anger. Dill was quiet, his hands still, and I wondered if he'd carry this with him when he left for Meridian, a piece of Maycomb's heart in his suitcase. One afternoon, I sat on the porch, the air heavy with the hum of cicadas and the faint glow of fireflies as evening crept in. Jem was inside, reading, his air rifle untouched, like he'd outgrown it. I found a roly-poly bug crawling across the step, its gray body curling into a ball when I touched it. I thought about squashing it, my finger hovering, but Jem's voice stopped me, sharp and sudden, saying to let it go, that it hadn't hurt anyone. I looked at him, surprised, seeing the trial in his eyes, Tom's death in his voice. I let the bug roll away, its tiny life spared, and felt a pang, like I'd understood something new about Jem, about what Maycomb's injustice had done to him. The Radley place watched, its shutters still, and I wondered if Boo saw the bug, if he knew about Tom, if he felt the town's pain like we did. Dill joined us, his last days in Maycomb ticking down, and we sat in silence, the porch swing creaking under us. He talked about leaving, about his mother, about Meridian, but his voice was soft, like he was saying goodbye to more than just us. I thought about Calpurnia, about her church, about the folks who'd left food at our door, and felt a spark of hope, small but stubborn, that Maycomb wasn't all cruel. Atticus came out, his tie loose, his face tired but kind, and sat with us, the stars bright above. He didn't talk about Tom, but his presence was enough, a quiet strength that held us together. Aunt Alexandra watched from the door, her face softer, like she was learning to see Atticus's fight in a new light. The town was quieter now, its gossip fading, but Bob Yule's threat still lingered, a dark thread in Maycomb's weave. We heard whispers of his anger, his drunken talk about Atticus, and I felt a chill, remembering his eyes in the courtroom, his spit in the street. Jem said we should watch out, his voice low, like he was carrying Atticus's safety now. Dill nodded, his eyes on the Radley place, and I wondered what he'd tell folks back home, about Maycomb, about us. The air was warm, the night alive with crickets, but the trial's shadow was long, and Tom's death was a wound that wouldn't close. As summer gave way to fall, Maycomb's heart was laid bare, its cruelty and kindness tangled together, and a new moment was coming, one that would show us the town through the eyes of its children, pulling Jem, Dill, and me deeper into the struggle to find hope in a world that broke songbirds. The town's response to Tom's death was fading, but a new season was beginning, one that would bring school, new lessons, and a chance to see Maycomb's soul through fresh eyes, drawing us closer to the truth of our home. Tom Robinson's death had left Maycomb quieter, its heart exposed by Mr. Underwood's words in the Tribune, comparing Tom to a songbird killed for no reason. Jem's anger had deepened, his protectiveness over a roly-poly bug, showing how the trial had changed him, while Dill's sadness lingered as he prepared to leave for Meridian. The town's reaction, some pity, some indifference, had shown us its divided soul, and Bob Yule's threat against Atticus still hung in the air, a dark promise we couldn't shake. The Radley place, with its silent shutters, watched over us, its mystery stirring again as summer faded, as fall brought school and new lessons. Jem and I were about to face Maycomb's contradictions anew, pulling us closer to the truth of our town and the man who lived in its shadows. Fall settled over Maycomb, the air crisp, with the smell of dry leaves and chimney smoke. The days shorter, as the sun dipped low behind the oaks. School started again, and I was back in the classroom. My dress itching less now, my books heavier with the weight of third grade. Jem was in high school, his steps longer, his voice quieter, like the trial had built a wall between us. The Radley place loomed across the street, its shutters still, but its pull was stronger now, like it was calling me back to the days of our games. Before the courthouse changed everything, Atticus was busier, his lamp burning late, his face lined but calm, while Aunt Alexandra kept the house in order, her rule softer but her eyes watchful, as if she sensed the town's unrest. In school, our teacher, Miss Gates, was full of energy, her voice bright as she talked about current events, about democracy and fairness, about how America was different from places where people were judged for who they were. I sat at my desk, the smell of chalk and old books in the air, my mind drifting to the trial, to Tom's face on the stand, to the jury's blank stares. Miss Gates spoke of justice, but her words felt hollow, like they didn't reach Maycomb's heart. I raised my hand, my voice small, asking about Tom, about why the jury didn't see his truth. The room went quiet, desks creaking, and Miss Gates' smile tightened, saying it was complicated, that Maycomb had its ways, that we'd understand when we were older. I felt a spark of anger, Jem's kind, and wanted to push back, but her eyes moved on, the lesson shifting to safer ground. At home, I told Jem about Miss Gates, about her talk of fairness, that didn't match what we'd seen. He was on the porch, his books scattered, the air warm with the scent of pine and evening dew. His face darkened, his voice sharp, saying it wasn't right. That folks like Miss Gates could talk about justice, but turn away from it when it was close. He said he'd never understand Maycomb, that the trial had shown him its true face. And I saw the hurt in his eyes, the same hurt that had stopped him from squashing the roly-poly. I thought about Atticus, about his calm words after the verdict, about how he'd said change was slow, but worth fighting for. Jem wasn't there yet, his anger too raw, and I felt a gap between us, like he was seeing a world I couldn't reach. The Radley place pulled at me that evening, its windows dark, its porch empty under the moonlight. I sat on our steps, the air alive with crickets, and thought about Boo, about the gifts in the tree, the blanket on my shoulders that cold night. The trial had made him feel closer, like he was part of Maycomb's hidden heart, watching the town's pain as we did. I wondered what he thought of Tom, of Atticus, of the jury that chose lies over truth. I wanted to see him, to ask him, but the shutters stayed closed, the house silent, and I felt a pang, like I was missing something I'd never had. Jem joined me, his air rifle across his lap, and said he didn't care about Boo anymore, that the real monsters were in the courthouse, not the Radley place. His words stung, but I saw his point. The trial's shadow longer than any ghost story. Still, it was gone now, back to Meridian, his letters full of stories, but tinged with the sadness he'd carried from Mac. I missed his chatter, his way of making the world lighter, and felt the porch emptier without him. Atticus came out, his tie loose, his eyes tired but kind, and sat with us, the stars bright above. He didn't talk about the trial, but he asked, about school, about Miss Gates, and I told him what she'd said, my voice small. He nodded, saying folks often saw justice clearer far away than in their own town, that Maycomb was learning, even if it hurt. His words were like a bridge, trying to reach Jem. But Jem looked away, his face hard, like he wasn't ready to believe. The town was settling into fall, its streets quieter, the air carrying the faint hum of harvest and wood smoke. We heard less about Bob Ewell, but his threat still lingered, a whisper in the back of my mind. Calpurnia was in the kitchen, her hands busy with supper, the smell of cornbread and greens filling the house. She didn't talk about Tom, but I saw her pause when Atticus spoke, her eyes soft, like she carried his fight, too. Aunt Alexandra was different now, her talk of Finch pride quieter, her respect for Atticus clearer, like the trial had shown her something new. Maycomb was a puzzle, its pieces hypocrisy, kindness, fear, hope still not fitting together, but I felt closer to understanding it, even if Jem was lost in his anger. As the days grew shorter, the Radley place watched, its silence a kind of comfort, like Boo was there, sharing our questions about Maycomb's heart. The trial's wound was still raw, but school and stories were pulling us forward, and a new moment was coming, one that would test our view of the town and its shadows. Fall was deepening, and Maycomb's contradictions were growing clearer, drawing Jem and me toward a moment that would bring the Radley place back into focus, pulling us closer to the truth of our town and the man who hid within it. Fall had settled over Maycomb, its crisp air and school lessons bringing a new rhythm. But the trial's shadow lingered, with Miss Gates's talk of justice ringing hollow against Tom Robinson's death. Jem's anger had hardened, his rejection of Boo Radley's mystery a sign of how the courthouse had changed him. While my thoughts kept drifting to the Radley place, its shutters a quiet pull against the town's unrest. Atticus's steady presence held us together, but Bob Yule's threat still hung in the air, a dark undercurrent in Mackham's heart. The Radley place watched, its silence a kind of witness. And as October brought new events, the town's tensions were stirring again, pulling Jem and me toward a night that would test our world in ways we couldn't foresee. October's chill crept into Maycomb, the air sharp with the smell of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The days growing shorter as the town settled into fall. The streets were alive with the hum of harvest, wagons creaking, and kids chasing the last of the warm afternoons. At home, Atticus was quieter, his lamp burning late as he worked on cases. His face lined but calm, like he carried the trial's weight without letting it break him. Aunt Alexandra was busy, her missionary circle meetings behind her, now focused on organizing the town's Halloween pageant. Her voice sharp but her eyes softer, like she was finding her place in Atticus's fight. Jem was in high school, his books heavy, his steps heavy, too, like the verdict still weighed on him. I felt the gap between us, my third-grade world small against his, but I missed his old grin, his stories of Boo. The town was moving on. But Bob Yule's shadow lingered, his anger a ripple that wouldn't fade. We heard whispers of his doings, how he'd lost his relief job, blaming Atticus for it, his voice loud with drink in the bars, cursing the Finches. Miss Stephanie Crawford, her eyes bright with gossip, told us he'd tried to break into Judge Taylor's house, creeping around in the dark, only to run when the judge's dog barked. Another day, we learned he'd followed Helen Robinson, Tom's widow, to her new job at Link Deese's place, whispering threats until Link warned him off, his voice sharp enough to scare Bob quiet, at least for a while. I felt a chill, remembering Bob's eyes in the courtroom, his spit in Atticus's face, and wondered if his threat was more than talk, if it could reach us. Atticus brushed it off, his voice calm, saying Bob was a coward, that his kind burned out their hate fast. But Jem wasn't convinced, his eyes dark as he watched the street, like he was guarding us now, too. I thought of the Radley place, its shutters still, and wondered if Boo heard the town's whispers, if he knew about Bob Yule's anger. Was quieter, her hands busy with supper, the smell of cornbread and greens filling the house. But I saw her glance at Atticus, her eyes soft, like she worried for him, too. Aunt Alexandra was different now, her talk of Finch pride gone, replaced by a quiet respect for Atticus. Like the trial had shown her his strength in a new light. The Halloween pageant was the talk of Maycomb, a chance to bring the town together. After the trial's divide, Aunt Alexandra was in charge, her lists long, her voice firm as she planned costumes and booths at the high school. I was to be a ham, my costume a wire cage wrapped in brown cloth, hot and clumsy but part of the show. Jem was too old for the kids' pageant, but he agreed to walk me there, his air rifle tucked away, his voice gruff but kind, like he was trying to be the brother I remembered. The air was alive with excitement, kids running through the streets, their laughter mixing with the crunch of leaves. But I felt a nervousness, like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. We practiced my part at home, the costume wobbling as I moved, Calpurnia's laughter rare but warm. When I tripped, Atticus watched, his smile soft, saying I'd steal the show, but his eyes were tired, like he saw more than he said. The Radley place loomed across the street, its porch empty, its windows dark, and I thought of Boo, of the gifts in the tree, the blanket on my shoulders. The trial had pushed him to the back of my mind, but now he felt close again, like he was part of Maycomb's hidden heart, watching the town's tensions rise. Jem said he didn't care about Boo anymore, but I saw him glance at the house, like he wasn't as sure as he sounded. The town was busy, its streets bright with lanterns and pumpkins, the air carrying the sweet smell of caramel apples and hay. But Bob Yule's name kept surfacing, his threats a dark thread in Maycomb's weave. We heard he'd been seen near the school, his figure slinking in the shadows, and I felt a prickle of fear, wondering if he'd come for Atticus. For us, Jem said we'd be fine. his voice steady, but his hand tightened on my arm when we passed the dark alleys. Calpurnia stayed close, her eyes sharp, and Aunt Alexandra checked the locks at night, her face tight, like she felt the threat. To Maycomb was a puzzle, its pieces kindness, fear, hope, hate not fitting together. But the pageant was coming, and with it, a night that would change everything. As October's end neared, the air grew colder, the stars brighter above Oaks. Jem and I prepared for the pageant, my ham costume wobbling, his steps protective beside me. The Radley place watched, its silence heavy, and I felt Boo's presence, like he was waiting. The trial's wound was still raw, Bob Yule's threat a growing shadow, and the night ahead would test Maycomb's heart, pulling Jem and me into a moment we couldn't escape. The pageant was coming, and with it, a dark night that would bring danger, courage, and a figure from the shadows, drawing Jem and me closer to the truth of Maycomb, and the man who lived in its heart. October had brought a restless energy to Maycomb, with the Halloween pageant stirring the town. Still, Bob Yule's threats cast a dark shadow, his anger spilling into acts against Judge Taylor and Helen Robinson. Atticus's calm dismissal of Bob's threats did little to ease Jem's worry, and my ham costume for the pageant felt clumsy, a symbol of the town's uneasy mix of festivity and fear. The Radley place, with its silent shutters, watched as we prepared for the night ahead, its mysteries closer now, like a whisper we couldn't ignore. As the pageant loomed, Jem and I were stepping into a night that would bring danger and a figure from the shadows, pulling us deeper into Maycomb's heart and the truth of the man who lived in its silence. The night of the Halloween pageant was the air sharp with the smell of fallen leaves, bonfires, and the faint sweetness of caramel apples drifting from the high school. Maycomb's streets were alive with kids in costumes, ghosts, witches, and farmers, their laughter echoing under the glow of lanterns strung across the square. At home, my ham costume was a cage of wire and cloth, hot and heavy, making me waddle as I practiced my steps. Jem was beside me, his high school books left behind, his face serious but kind as he promised to walk me to the school. Atticus was in his study, his lamp casting a warm glow, his voice soft as he wished me luck, but I saw a flicker of worry in his eyes, like he felt the night's unease. Aunt Alexandra fussed over my costume, her hands quick, her voice sharp, but warm, like she was holding us close in her own way. We left for the school, the stars bright above, the Radley place dark and still. As we passed, its shutters a quiet reminder of Boo, of the gifts and the blanket, of the mystery we'd almost forgotten. Jem held my hand, his steps steady, but I felt his tension, his eyes scanning the shadows, like he was watching for Bob Yule. The town was festive, the high school buzzing with voices, the air thick with the smell of hay and popcorn. Inside, the auditorium was a sea of faces, kids giggling, parents clapping, the stage bright with homemade props. My turn came, but Mrs. Merriweather called me late, my entrance clumsy in the ham costume, and the crowd laughed, their voices loud in the hot, crowded room. I stood in the wings after, my face burning, the costume sticking to my skin, wishing I could run back to Jem. The pageant ended, and the crowd spilled out, the night darker now, the air colder as the lanterns dimmed. Jem found me, his voice teasing, but gentle, saying I'd been the best ham Maycomb ever saw. We stayed for the fair, playing games, eating candy, but the fun felt thin, like the town was pretending to forget the trial, Tom's death, Bob Yule's threats. When it was time to go, the school was quiet, the parking lot empty, the oak trees casting long shadows under the moonlight. Jem said we'd take the shortcut home, through the dark path behind the school, and I felt a prickle of fear, the costume heavy, my steps slow. The night was alive with crickets, the air sharp with pine, but something felt wrong, like the dark was watching us. We walked, Jem's hand on my shoulder, the path crunching under our feet, the Radley place not far off, its silence heavier now. Then we heard its steps behind us, not the playful shuffle of kids, but heavy, deliberate, closer with each breath. Jem stopped, his voice low, saying it was probably nothing, but his grip tightened. The steps quickened, and before I could speak, a shadow lunged, a grunt, a struggle, and Jem was on the ground, his arm cracking like a dry branch. I screamed, the costume trapping me, my arms pinned as I fell, the smell of dirt and sweat sharp in my nose. A figure was on us, his breath hot, with liquor, his hands rough, and I knew it was Bob Yule, his threat come to life in the dark. Then another shadow moved, fast and silent, pulling Bob away. The sounds of a fight, grunts, thuds, a sharp cry filling the night. I struggled in the costume, my heart pounding, Jem's name on my lips, but he was still, too still. The second figure was gone, and Bob was down, the air heavy with silence, broken only by my ragged breaths. I stumbled to Jem, his face pale under the moonlight, his arm twisted wrong, and I cried out, fear choking me. Then someone was there, lifting Jem, strong arms carrying him, the smell of clean cotton and soap, faint but familiar. I followed, my costume tearing, the path leading us home, the Radley place looming as we passed. Its door open now, a light flickering inside dotted home. The porch light was on, Atticus's face pale as he saw us, his voice sharp with fear as he called for Aunt Alexandra, for Calpurnia. The man set Jem on the couch, his face hidden in shadow. But I knew Boo Radley, his eyes soft, his hands trembling as he stepped back. Atticus called the doctor, Sheriff Tate, his hands steady but his eyes wild, checking Jem's pulse, his broken arm. Aunt Alexandra was there, her face white, her hand shaking as she brought blankets. Calpurnia's eyes were wet, her voice low, saying she'd pray for Jem. I stood frozen, the ham costume in tatters. My mind racing. Bob Ewell, the fight, Boo's quiet presence, saving us from the dark. The house was a storm of voices. The phone ringing, the doctor's bag clinking as he worked on Jem. Sheriff Tate arrived, his boots heavy, his face grim, as he said Bob Ewell was dead. A knife in his ribs, found under the oak. I looked at Boo, his pale face in the lamplight, his eyes on Jem, and felt a rush of gratitude, fear, and wonder. The Radley place wasn't a mystery anymore. Was Boo real and here? His silence a kind of courage. The trial, Tom's death, Bob's hate, had all led to this. A night that broke Maycomb's heart open, showing us the man who'd watched from the shadows. As the doctor worked, the house quieted, the air heavy with the smell of antiseptic and coffee, the night pressing against the windows. Jem stirred, his eyes fluttering, and I held his hand, my heart easing. Boo stood by the wall, his presence a quiet anchor, and I knew Maycomb would never be the same. Not for us. Not for him. The night had changed everything, and as the sheriff spoke, questions of what happened, of who did what, would pull Jem, me, and Boo deeper into Maycomb's truth, revealing the cost of courage and the heart of the man who saved us. The Halloween pageant had turned into a nightmare, with Bob Ewell's attack on Jem and me in the dark path behind the school, his breath hot with hate as he broke Jem's arm and pinned me in my ham costume. A shadow. Boo Radley had saved us, pulling Bob away, his knife ending the threat under the oak. Boo carried Jem home, his quiet presence a shock in our living room, where Atticus, Aunt Alexandra, and Calpurnia rallied around Jem's broken form. The Radley place, once a mystery, was open now, its lights spilling out, and Boo was no longer a ghost, but a man, pale and real, standing in our home. As the doctor worked and Sheriff Tate arrived, the night's truth was unfolding, pulling Jem and me deeper into Maycomb's heart, and the courage of the man who'd watched from the shadows. The house was a storm of light and sound, the air thick, with the smell of antiseptic coffee, and the faint metallic temps of fear. Jem lay on the couch, his face pale, his arm splintered by the doctor, his breath shallow but steady. Atticus stood by him, his hands steady but his eyes wild, checking Jem's pulse, his voice low as he asked the doctor questions. Aunt Alexandra was a shadow in the corner, her face white, her hands twisting a handkerchief, her usual composure cracked by the sight of Jem's pain. Calpurnia crept, bringing water, her eyes wet but her hands sure, her voice a soft murmur of prayers for Jem. I stood near the door, my ham costume in tatters, the cloth torn and dirty, my heart still pounding from the dark path, from Bob Ewell's hands, from Boo's rescue. Boo Radley stood against the wall, his figure slight, his face pale as moonlight, his eyes soft but nervous, darting from Jem to Atticus to me. He was older than I'd imagined, his hair thin, his hands trembling slightly. But there was a gentleness in him, like he carried the Radley place's silence in his bones. I stared, my mind racing with the gifts in the tree, the blanket on my shoulders, the stories we'd spun about him. He wasn't a ghost, not a monster, but a man who'd saved us, his courage hidden until the night called it out. I wanted to thank him, to say his name, but my voice was caught, my eyes locked on his, seeing Maycomb's hidden heart in his quiet gaze. Sheriff Tate filled the room, his boots heavy on the floor, his hat in his hands, his face grim as he spoke to Atticus. He said Bob Ewell was dead, found under the oak with a kitchen knife in his ribs, his body still in the dirt where he'd fallen. He asked me to tell what happened, his voice gentle but firm, and I did, my words tumbling out the dark path. The heavy steps, Jem's cry, the struggle, the shadow that pulled Bob away. The room was quiet, the air thick, as I described the man who'd saved us, my eyes drifting to Boo, his face unchanged, but his hands clenched, like he was bracing for what came next. Atticus listened, his face pale, his eyes on me, then Boo, like he was piecing together a puzzle he hadn't expected. I walked them through the night. The crunch of leaves, the smell of liquor on Bob's breath, the snap of Jem's arm, the thud of the fight. I said I hadn't seen much, trapped in the costume, but I knew Boo had been there, his arms strong, his presence a shield against Bob's hate. Sheriff Tate nodded, his eyes sharp, asking if I was sure, if I'd seen the knife, if Boo had fought Bob. I said I didn't know, that it happened too fast, but Boo's eyes met mine, soft and steady, and I felt he didn't want the spotlight, didn't want the town's eyes on him. Atticus's voice was low, saying Boo had saved his children, that he owed him more than words could say, and I saw Boo's shoulders relax, like Atticus's gratitude was enough. The doctor said Jem would, okay, his arm broken, but healing, his sleep deep from the medicine. Aunt Alexandra brought tea, her hands steadier now, her eyes on Boo, like she was seeing him for the first time. Calpurnia stood by Jem, her hand brushing his hair, her face soft with relief. The Radley place was just across the street, its light, still on its door open, and I imagined Boo walking back, disappearing into its silence again. But he was here now, real and quiet, his courage alight in Maycomb's dark night. I thought of Tom Robinson, of the trial, of how Bob's hate had tied it all together. His attack a final act of the prejudice Atticus had fought. Sheriff Tate paced, his voice low, saying he'd have to write a report, that folks would want answers about Bob's death. He looked at Boo, then Atticus, his eyes narrowing, like he was weighing something heavy. I felt a chill, remembering the trial's whispers, the town's judgment, and wondering what Maycomb would make of Boo, of a man they'd feared stepping into their world. Atticus's face was calm, but his hands were tight, like he knew that night wasn't over, that the truth of what happened would test Maycomb's heart again. I stood by Boo, my hand close to his, wanting him to know we saw him, not the ghost, not the story, but the man who'd saved us. The house settled, the air heavy with the smell of lamp oil and worry, the night pressing against the windows. Jem's breaths were steady, a small comfort, and Boo's presence was a quiet anchor, his silence louder than the town's noise. The Radley place waited, its shadows part of us now, and I knew the night's story wasn't finished, that questions of justice and courage would linger as Sheriff Tate prepared to leave. The truth of what happened under the oak was coming into focus, and a conversation between Atticus and the sheriff would reveal the cost of protecting Boo, pulling Jem and me deeper into Maycomb's heart and the man who'd changed it. Asterisk. The night of the Halloween pageant had turned Maycomb upside down, with Bob Ewell's attack on Jem and me answered by Boo Radley's quiet courage, his shadow pulling Bob away and saving us under the oak. Boo had carried Jem home, his pale face and soft eyes a shock in our living room, where Atticus, Aunt Alexandra, and Calpurnia hovered over Jem's broken arm. Sheriff Tate's grim news, Bob Ewell, dead, a knife in his ribs, had left us reeling, and my recounting of the attack had painted Boo as our savior, his silence louder than the town's noise. The Radley place, once a mystery, was part of us now, its light spilling into our lives. As the night deepened, a debate over truth and justice was coming, pulling Jem, me, and Boo deeper into Maycomb's heart, and the cost of protecting the innocent. Asterisk. The house was quieter now, the air heavy with the smell of antiseptic coffee, and the faint warmth of lamplight cutting through the night. Jem slept on the couch, his face pale but peaceful, his splintered arm a stark reminder of Bob Ewell's hate. Atticus sat nearby, his glasses low on his nose, his hands steady but his eyes tired, carrying the weight of the night's events. Aunt Alexandra moved silently, her face still pale, her hands busy with blankets, her usual sharpness softened by worry and relief. Calpurnia was in the kitchen, her footsteps soft, her voice a low hum of prayers for Jem, for us all. Boo Radley stood against the wall, his figure slight, his pale hands folded, his eyes darting from Jem to me, like he was still guarding us. His courage, a quiet flame in the room. Sheriff Tate stood in the center, his hat in his hands, his boots scuffing the floor. His voice low, but firm as he spoke to Atticus. He said Bob Yule was dead, found under the oak with a kitchen knife in his ribs, and the town would want answers, a story to settle their whispers. Atticus's face tightened, his voice sharp, saying it had to be the truth. That Jem couldn't have done it, that his boy was no killer. I listened, my heart pounding, the torn ham costume still clinging to me, my mind racing with the dark path, the struggle, Boo's shadow moving fast. Sheriff Tate shook his head, his eyes steady, saying it wasn't Jem. That Bob had fallen on his own knife, drunk and clumsy, a story to keep things simple, to keep Boo out of the spotlight. Atticus stood, his voice rising, saying the truth mattered, that hiding it would teach Jem the wrong lesson, that justice had to be clear, even after all Maycomb had done to Tom Robinson. He paced, his hands tight, his eyes on Boo, like he owed him honesty as much as gratitude. Sheriff Tate leaned forward, his voice softer now, saying Boo didn't need the town's eyes on him. That dragging him into court would be like killing a songbird, something innocent that only brought good. I thought of Mr. Underwood's words, in the Tribune, of Tom's death, and felt a lump in my throat, understanding what Tate meant, what Boo's silence had cost him. Boo's eyes met mine, soft and nervous, and I knew he wanted the shadows, not the town's glare. I spoke up, my voice small, saying Boo saved us, that he didn't want to hurt anyone, that he was our friend. Atticus looked at me, his eyes softening, like he saw the night through my eyes, saw Boo's courage in a new light. He sat, his hands loose now, and nodded, saying if Tate thought it was best, he'd let it go, that Boo deserved peace. Tate, face relaxed, his voice low, saying Bob Yule's death was justice in its own way. That Maycomb didn't need another trial, another wound. I stood by Boo, my hand close to his, feeling his warmth, his quiet strength, and knew he'd go back to the Radley place, his life hidden again, but not to us, not anymore. The room was still, the air thick with the weight of their words, the smell of lamp oil and worry lingering. Aunt Alexandra brought tea, her eyes on Boo, like she was seeing him for the first time, her gratitude silent but deep. Calpurnia stood by Jem, her hand brushing his hair, her face calm now, like she trusted Atticus's choice. I looked at Boo, his pale face glowing in the lamplight, and felt a rush of warmth, like he was part of our family now. His courage tying him to us. The Radley place was across the street, its light faint but steady, and I imagined Boo walking back, his steps soft, his heart full of the night he'd stepped out of the shadows. Sheriff Tate left, his boots heavy on the porch, his voice low, as he said he'd handle the report, keep it simple. Atticus sat by Jem, his hand on his son's shoulder, his face tired but calm, like he'd made peace with the night's truth. I stood by Boo, wanting to say more, to thank him, but his eyes said he understood, that he didn't need words. The trial, Tom's death, Bob's hate had all led to this. A moment where justice wasn't in a courtroom but in a choice to protect the innocent. To let Boo stay a songbird, not a spectacle. The house settled, the night pressing against the windows, the air warm with the hum of crickets and the faint glow of stars. Jem's breaths were steady, a small comfort. And Boo's presence was a quiet anchor, his silence a gift we'd carry forever. The Radley place waited, its shadows part of us now, and I knew the night's story was almost done. But one last moment with Boo would show me Maycomb's heart in a way I'd never forget. As the night wound down, Boo's time with us was ending, and a final walk would reveal the depth of his kindness, pulling Jem and me closer to the truth of Maycomb and the man who'd saved us from its darkness. The night of Bob Yule's attack had changed Maycomb forever, with Boo Radley's quiet courage saving Jem and me from the darkness under the oak. Sheriff Tate's choice to call Bob's death an accident, to protect Boo from the town's spotlight, had settled the night, leaving Atticus to wrestle with truth and justice in our lamplit living room. Boo stood with us, his pale face and soft eyes a bridge between the Radley place's mystery and our reality. His silence, a gift we'd carry forever. Jem slept, his arm broken but healing, and the trial's long shadow Tom Robinson's death. Maycomb's prejudice felt closer to resolution. As the night wound down, one last moment with Boo would show me Maycomb's heart through Atticus's lessons, pulling Jem and me into a final understanding of the man who'd watched from the shadows and the town we called home. The house was still, the air warm with the smell of lamp oil, coffee, and the faint antiseptic temps from Jem's bandages. Jem slept on the couch, his breath steady, his face calm under the lamplight. His splintered arm a reminder of the night's cost. Atticus sat nearby, his glasses off, his eyes tired but kind, his hands folded as he watched Jem, like he was guarding him even in sleep. Aunt Alexandra cripped, her face softer now, her hands bringing blankets, her worry easing as Jem's color returned. Calpurnia was in the kitchen, her footsteps light, her voice a low hum of relief, her prayers answered in Jem's steady breaths. I stood by Boo Radley, his figure slight against the wall, his pale hands trembling, his eyes soft as they met mine, like he saw me, really saw me. For the first time, I took Boo's hand, my fingers small in his, and asked if he wanted to see Jem, to say goodnight before he went home. His nod was slight, his steps hesitant, but he followed me to Jem's side. The floor creaking under us, the air heavy with the night's weight. Boo looked at Jem, his eyes tracing the bandages, the pale face, and I saw a flicker of sadness, like he wished he'd stopped Bob sooner. I said Jem would be okay, that Atticus said so, and Boo's shoulders relaxed, his hand brushing Jem's blanket. A gentle touch that felt like a promise. I led him to the porch, the night cool now, the stars bright above Maycomb's oaks. The Radley place across the street, its light, faint but steady, calling him back. We stood on the porch, the air sharp, with the smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke, the town quiet except for the hum of crickets and the distant bark of a dog. I looked at Boo, his face pale in the moonlight, his eyes nervous but warm, and felt a rush of gratitude. Like he was a friend I'd always known. I thought of the gifts in the tree gum, a watch, a spelling medal, the blanket on my shoulders that cold night. The stories we'd spun about a ghost who was never a ghost at all. I said his name, Mr. Arthur, soft and sure, and his eyes lit up, like hearing it meant something. I wanted to ask him about the Radley place, about why he stayed inside, but his silence was enough, his presence a story louder than words. Atticus came out, his voice gentle, saying it was time for Boo to go, that he'd done more than enough for us. He thanked him, his hand on Boo's shoulder, and I saw Boo's face soften, like Atticus's words were a gift he hadn't expected. I walked Boo across the street, my steps slow, his hand still in mine, the Radley place looming, its shutters open, its porch empty but welcoming. At the door, Boo paused, his eyes on me, and I said goodnight, my voice small but full, knowing I'd never see him again, not like this. He stepped inside, the door closing softly, the light fading, and I felt a pang, like a chapter of me had closed with him. Back home, Atticus sat with me on the porch, the air cool, the stars a blanket over the town. I told him about Boo, about how he wasn't scary, how he was kind, how I understood now what he'd said about walking in someone's shoes. Atticus nodded, his smile soft, saying most folks were good when you saw them, really saw them, and I thought of Boo, of Tom, of Maycomb's heart, its cruelty and its kindness tangled together. He read to me from one of Jem's books, The Grey Ghost, the words weaving, a story of mystery and truth, like our own. The pages turned, the night deepened, and I felt the trial, Tom's death, Bob's hate, Boo's courage, all settling into me, like lessons I'd carry forever. Jem slept inside, his arm healing, his anger waiting for another day. Aunt Alexandra was quieter, her rules gone, her respect for Atticus clear in her eyes. Calpurnia moved through the house, her strength a steady hum, like she'd always been part of our fight. The Radley place was dark now, its shutters closed, but Boo wasn't a mystery anymore. He was a friend, a songbird, a piece of Maycomb's hidden heart. I thought of Miss Maudie, of Mr. Underwood, of the folks who'd left food at our door, and felt a spark of hope, small but stubborn, that Maycomb could change, even if it was slow. The night wrapped around us, the air alive with the hum of fall, the smell of pine and earth grounding me. Atticus's voice was a comfort, his words about seeing folks clear echoing in my mind. The trial had shown us Maycomb's shadows, but Boo had shown us its light, and I knew I'd carry that, too, as I grew up in a town that was learning, stumbling, but trying. I leaned against Atticus, his arm warm around me, and felt the world settle, the stars bright above, Maycomb's heart beating in a quiet dot. As fall deepened, the Finches were changed, and Maycomb with us. Its lessons of justice, courage, and kindness woven into our lives, a story of a town and its people, flawed but growing, under the watchful eyes of those who dared to see. The night had settled over Maycomb, its stars bright above the oaks, the air cool with the hum of fall and the faint scent of pine and earth. Jem slept inside, his arm healing, his heart still carrying the trial's weight, but growing stronger. In the quiet, Atticus sat with me on the porch, his voice a steady comfort, his lessons about seeing folks clear Boo Radley, Tom Robinson, even Maycomb itself woven into my bones. The Radley place was dark now, its shutters closed. But Boo's kindness lingered, his courage a light in our town's shadows. Aunt Alexandra moved through the house, her rules softer, her respect for Atticus a silent strength. Calpurnia's hands were steady, her prayers answered in our safety, her heart tied to ours. Maycomb was flawed, its heart tangled with prejudice and hope, but through Atticus's fight, Boo's bravery, and the small acts of kindness we'd seen, I felt a spark, a promise that our town could grow, could learn to see. As the crickets sang and the night wrapped around us, I leaned against Atticus, his arm warm, and knew this summer, this trial, this night had changed us, leaving us with a story of courage, empathy, and a town stumbling toward its better self.